Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is October the 22nd, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world. That is world history, foreign policy, economics, current events, which have been maybe kind of saucy recently. Let's see what Agent Smith has for us. As a reminder, this is a conversation, so if you want to weigh in on the conversation or say that we're dead wrong about something, feel free. Without any further ado, let's begin World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Doing pretty well. How are you doing?
A little tired. I was up late. I finally finished my first playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 last night.
Wow. Nice. I haven't finished it yet.
Oh, okay.
I've made multiple characters, though, so... yeah.
That's the temptation, right?
Yeah. You can just change your class, but some of it is the companions that you have and how the story is with them in the party. So I have like different companion loadouts in the different characters. So you kind of want to learn what each of them does, but you can't do it for all of them at the same time.
Yeah. I won't say anything then, but definitely let me know when you finish. I'd be interested in what you had to say about it.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how much you leaned into the illithid magic, because that's a decision that I've made.
Oh yeah, you can
from my
like
friends.
you can consume the worms, right? Yeah, I didn't do any of that on purpose.
Yeah, dude, same. I specifically chose not to, just for like a character lore perspective of like, ew, like what? Stick that in my face? No, absolutely not. So I never did, and then I'm running with my friend streamer Apoptosis, and he just eats all of them, and it gives you like jacked abilities and powers that are just super strong. So they're basically direct buffs to your character. So for you to refuse them is like a decision that inhibits your max power, but can be really important for your character and like building what their decisions would actually be. It's part of the role play, I guess.
Yeah. You'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Keep on going.
Yeah, I'm pretty far, but not to the end yet, so we'll see.
Actually, how far along are you? You're probably in Act 3 by now, right?
Yeah, I'm in Act 3. I'm in the city.
Gotcha.
And then it's the dude who just got his new rulership, and then the blood lady who just wants to kill everybody. And I'm kind of, yeah. They're kind of competing for my attention. They're like,
kill the other one for me. No, kill them for me. I'll do this for you. I'll do that for you.
and it's like, y'all are silly. Just sort it out yourselves like adults. But they can't. So yeah, Baldur's Gate 3, good game. I'm glad you enjoyed it and stuff. Spoilers not like this. I guess we should have spoiler warning it or whatever, but it's not. Actually, it's not plot breaking for any of that, because I think those things happen regardless of what you do. And it's not a spoiler, really. There are pretty big spoilers. But if anyone's seen the trailer for it, basically you start out on a nautiloid ship, which is Mind Flayer territory. So Mind Flayers are definitely a big theme in the whole game. So yeah, the week so far, chat was saying that the news was relatively slow, but there's still things going on. I have a little list. I don't know if you were listening in while I was fielding some questions and whatnot from what's been going on.
I guess not. What did they have to say?
So Dagnip is here, and he was saying that the Argentina election is going to a ballotage, which I believe is the same as a runoff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he has mixed feelings about that, where maybe his person will win because they're leading right now, but there's a strong anti-vote against him or something.
Yeah, there's a big protest vote for this right-wing guy. I think his name is Millet, or maybe Millet. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. But I think Dagnip described him as a minarchist. Certainly he has what in the United States would be considered very strong libertarian leanings.
What's a minarchist?
It's not. It's like just short of an anarchist.
Oh, so you don't want absolutely zero government, but you want as little as possible.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Gotcha.
But yeah, one of the things he wants to do is get rid of the central bank, for example. And he also wants to dollarize the economy. In other words, adopt the US dollar as the official currency.
Ooh. Interesting.
Yeah, it's Getting rid of the central bank would be a more dramatic move than dollarizing the economy.
What are the downsides of dollarizing your economy if you're not the U.S.?
I guess there are short-term and long-term penalties there. So over the short term, anybody who's still getting paid in, well, I think they use pesos in Argentina, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Chad, but I believe Argentina currently has the Argentine peso, and anybody still getting paid in Argentine pesos would probably lose out because probably a good chunk of their savings are in pesos. So those people would probably find it difficult. For one, they would probably take a pay cut because it would be hard to get. It would be hard for their employers to just suddenly find a whole bunch of new dollars to pay them in. And also their savings would probably take a cut. It would kind of depend on how they implemented it. Hypothetically, everybody's savings denominated in pesos could be just replaced with dollars overnight. But there's a lot of private banks that would have to be involved in that, a lot of coordination. It would require a very large sum of US dollars that Argentina may or may not be able to acquire. The economy is not great right now, which is kind of how they got to this point in the first place. And not a lot of international lenders are that interested in lending to Argentina right now for the same reason, as well as just the general historical pattern of debt defaults in Argentina. So if they could get the money, they could make that work, and people would not take a hit to their savings from a conversion from pesos to dollars. But probably it would be more partial than that. Some people would have their savings covered. Banks would probably impose restrictions on withdrawals for some period of time in order to try to minimize that, but there probably would be some penalty even in spite of that. So those are kind of more the short-term costs. Supposedly, there could be inflation if they do that. That was something that was noted on the ground in Europe when everybody switched over to the euro way back in the, early aughts, I think it was. It wasn't supposed to happen. Like, theoretically, there's no inherent reason why everybody adopting the euro should have caused an increase in prices. But a lot of people reported that it did. So hypothetically, if Argentina adopted the dollar, that could happen as well. So those are kind of your short-term penalties. Long-term penalties, not having your own currency basically means that you don't have your own monetary policy. Because you can't manipulate interest rates in your economy as easily. And it also takes away the policy tool of devaluing or invaluing your currency in response to prevailing economic conditions in your country. So if you have an economic downturn, you would not be able to lower interest rates in order to try to make liquidity more accessible, such that it had an offsetting effect on the economic downturn. Correspondingly, if your economy starts overheating, in other words, starts growing too much, too fast, such that inflation starts going up, not having an independent monetary policy means that you can't increase interest rates in order to try to cool down the economy and slow it down such that inflation doesn't spiral out of control. So those tools are out of your toolbox if you don't have an independent monetary policy. And that would be the case if Argentina were to abandon the peso and just adopt the dollar as their official currency.
Which would make them have a dependent monetary policy where it's dependent on another country's monetary policy.
Dependent is not the word I would use, because it's not so much dependent as it is intertwined. Dependency implies that it's like a tool that the Federal Reserve in the United States would use against them, and that the Argentine government would have to go, cap in hand, begging them to make this, that, or the other adjustment on their behalf. But the reality is that, all central banks and all currencies are already intertwined. So it's not really an issue per se of increasing that degree of interdependency. It's more just that the central bank of Argentina would be more vulnerable to shifts in the economic winds in its own economy. It's doable. Other countries have done it, so it's not as though it's inherently a bad thing. It just leaves the country somewhat less flexible. In a lot of cases, that could be considered a bad thing. If countries do manage their currencies and their monetary policies responsibly, it can be a useful tool, although the past 10 years kind of suggests it's of limited utility. 10 some years, even longer now, 15 some years of quantitative easing did not seem to have a dramatic effect on economic performance, inflation, deflation, etc. So it's kind of debatable just how useful it is, but it's better to have it than not have it in the case of an emergency. Especially in the case of an emergency, having a major institution like a central bank is very useful, which is why, like I said, getting rid of the central bank is more dramatic than dollarizing. Even if you don't have your own currency, you still have a central bank. Like, it's basically the banker for the government and the lender of last resort for your private sector banks. So it still fulfills a useful role, even if it's not able to impose and implement an independent monetary policy.
So he's a pretty radical candidate then, in terms of what he proposes to change.
Yeah, it would be a pretty dramatic move. Economists will definitely pay a lot of attention if he gets elected and somehow manages to actually implement some of those policies that he's talking about. But I would point out that in the case of Argentina, given how badly the Argentine government has managed its monetary policy as well as its fiscal policy over the past couple decades, it probably would not be as damaging or dramatic in their case to abandon the peso and adopt the dollar. Because a lot of, if you live in a country with a lot of inflation, like, Argentina, it's very hard to protect your savings. It's very hard to preserve the value of your income. And prices go up like every day. So, you're getting paid basically based off of yesterday's prices. And in that sense, every day you're taking a pay cut. So, balancing your budget and trying to find ways to ensure that your savings, including your life savings, are not losing value is very challenging. And that effort in and of itself is actually a major inhibitor of economic activity. That's what in economics is called shoe leather cost. Basically, the cost of constantly having to run around and try to move your money around, change what you have your money invested in, exchange money for other currency, etc. Dealing with inflation is hard, and it's better to have stable, mild inflation such that people don't have to worry about it. For how many decades did people in the United States not even really think about inflation? It really wasn't until the pandemic, right, when inflation became an issue again for the first time in more than a generation. I would point out that, oil price inflation is kind of different than the inflation I'm talking about. Obviously, people didn't like it when gas prices went up dramatically, as they have many times over the past 20 years. But I'm talking about just broad macroeconomic inflation, the kind of inflation that we've seen only in the past couple years, where prices rise across the board to the point where the Federal Reserve feels the need to increase interest rates, where banks are feeling the pressure because, higher inflation eats into the real rate of return that banks have. Their rate of return is based off of prevailing interest rates, but inflation cuts into them. In fact, real interest rates are literally just nominal inflation. Real interest rates are literally just nominal interest rates minus inflation. So the higher inflation is, the lower the rate of return banks are getting. And so the inflation has been hurting them too. Of course, on the flip side, it helps debtors. If you owe money, inflation actually reduces the real value of your but even so, it's better to have mild inflation. And that's all to the better. The less stuff you have to worry about, the more confident you feel in going out and buying stuff. The more confident you feel in saving less and spending more. And that's to the benefit of any economy. But if you don't feel that security and you're constantly worried about, the value of your savings and whatnot, you're a lot more likely to be in a kind of economic defensive crouch, a financial defensive crouch, where you're saving more than you are spending, and where the stuff you spend money on tends to be more economical. You're not spending as much, and when you do spend, you try to maximize value. people don't worry as much about that when they feel financially secure, and so they're more likely to spend relatively more, and the stuff they spend money on is more likely to be relatively more expensive. They make the trade-off of relatively more quality or perhaps more luxury in exchange for that higher price, which is not something as many people would be doing in a more insecure economic environment. So that's the difficulty that you have when inflation is an issue. And that's kind of where Argentina is right now. So if they did abandon the peso, there would be issues there. But one of the upshots is that inflation would probably come under control again. Theoretically, that's what should happen. Other countries that have done this have seen that work out. So inflation would moderate significantly to the point where it would be fairly predictable. And that would be a major contributor to increased and improved economic activity in Argentina. That's not to say there wouldn't still be problems. Having macroeconomic stability in terms of the monetary side of the equation is not sufficient to ensure overall complete macroeconomic stability, because there's also the fiscal side, right? So adopting the dollar would mean monetary stability, but it would do nothing to resolve fiscal stability, which is largely a product of political outcomes, political machinations in Buenos Aires. And that, I think, would probably still remain unresolved. But again, the upshot is that, by removing the peso, you would be segregating the political dysfunction from the monetary policy. Up till now, the former has definitely been infecting the latter to the detriment of the overall economy. So, even if the political side remains dysfunctional, adopting the dollar allows for stability on that front, to the point where people can feel much more confident in the safety of their savings and the value of their currency, in this case being the dollar post-adoption. So we'll see what they do. It'll definitely be a very interesting case study.
When will the outcome be decided for that?
Today, I think. Well, okay, the election was today, but after that will be the runoff, and I don't know when that's going to be scheduled. I trust Dagnip would know better than I would. Yeah, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer early this time rather than at the end like last time. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything, something stupid, wrong, biased, etc., please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while I do this, but I'll definitely read it later. I enjoy the feedback of whatever kind it may be.
We accept scathing reviews and glowing praise as well. A couple other questions we had in the chat before we got started. Someone was asking about the U.S. battle groups in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. They're intercepting missiles from Yemen or something.
Yeah, the Houthis in Yemen fired a couple of missiles. I read them described as cruise missiles in the article I read, but I was a little dubious about that, because cruise missiles are pretty advanced kit to hand over to some ragtag rebel group in Yemen. So I'm thinking maybe it's more like rockets, probably. But I could be wrong. Maybe they actually did give them some drones or cruise missiles or something. But regardless, yeah, they fired some in the general direction of Israel. It's not entirely clear just what the intended target was. Again, because, as you say, they were intercepted by a U.S. destroyer that was stationed in the area. The U.S. government released a statement saying that the trajectory of the rockets missiles, I should say. The U.S. government released a statement saying that the trajectory of the missiles implied that the target was probably Israel. So it seems here that this could have been a signal sent by the Iranian government, which is backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen, that if they do not back off of the conflict, however you want to frame that, in Gaza, then there could be escalation in the region. Now, whether or not that's cheap talk, debatable. I'm still not really convinced that there will be significant escalation regardless. I don't doubt that there will be some, but I think it'll mostly just be showmanship. There's not really much that Iranian proxy groups in the region can actually tangibly do to Israel beyond just lobbing rockets at them. You know.
The Houthis also would want. I guess they don't like Israel as well.
Honestly, I don't think they really care. They're kind of caught in this 10-year life or death struggle with the Saudi-backed government in the south. I suspect that's going to be much more important to them. But the Iranian government gives them aid, financial and military to varying degrees. And so the Iranian government, I suspect, came to them and said, hey, we've done a lot for you. We have something we would like you to do for us in return. And if that's the case, it's probably not the first time. Maybe you remember, 4 years ago. Time flies. It was like 2019, I think, when some oil refineries in Saudi Arabia were actually attacked. And the attack was largely ascribed to the Iranian government. But technically, the attack was carried out by Houthi rebels in Yemen. But nobody believes it was like them acting of their own will, basically. Everybody just kind of assumed that they were doing it on behalf of their Iranian supporters. So in so much as that can be considered a case study, this would seem to be a similar example.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
Yeah, so again, this is most likely the Iranian government acting through proxies to signal to the Israeli government in order to try to pressure them. But there's only so much pressure that, again, lobbing rockets at a country can achieve. Israel is still in pole position in terms of military power. People keep talking about the danger that Hezbollah poses to Israel, but the reality is that the most that they could do is lob, 100,000 rockets, something like that, at Israel, which is a lot. They could probably kill a good number of people, but it's not going to destroy Israel. The only thing that would really accomplish is mobilizing Israel to deploy against them.
Can we get a reminder again for the difference between Hezbollah and Hamas?
Yeah, Hamas is a homegrown Palestinian organization that emerged in the occupied territories. I want to say in the late 1980s, early 90s. It was largely founded as more or less just yet another Palestinian resistance organization. There was a number of them that emerged in the first Intifada, the first uprising by the Palestinians against the Israeli occupation authorities. Eventually, they gained a lot more popularity, though, owing to their various successful attempts at providing sundry government services and other social services in Palestinian territories, which is something that the PLO, the nominal representative of the Palestinian people in the Palestinian Authority, the nominal pseudo-Palestinian government that was created as a result of the Oslo Accords with the Israeli government in the early 1990s. But over the course of its governance of the Palestinian territories, the Palestinian Authority, and more particularly the PLO, pretty much delegitimized themselves by way of incompetence and corruption. So by the time elections were held in 2006, which I believe were the first elections in the Palestinian Authority, the PLO had lost significant popularity, and Hamas had gained enough popularity that they were able to win that election and were set to become the political party in charge of running the Palestinian Authority correspondingly, which, of course, did not subsequently happen for reasons that are a whole conversation unto themselves, as can be so frequently said with regard to developments in the Israel-Palestine issue. But regardless, Hamas retained control of the Gaza Strip subsequently, hence their control of it today. They do have an Islamist bent to them. Their main ideology, in so much as they have one, is Palestinian resistance. But unlike other resistance organizations in Palestine, they're definitely much more socially conservative and much more entwined with sort of jihadi thinking, you might call it. So let's see, that's Hamas. Hezbollah is different. They have some Islamist tendencies, but kind of like Hamas, their main thing is resisting Israel. So Hezbollah was created during the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, which they were occupying from what I believe was the early 1980s up until the mid 90s. And the reason that they were occupying it is because the PLO at that time had taken up, how should I put it? They had relocated to southern Lebanon in the late 70s for reasons that, again, are a whole conversation unto themselves. It is a whole conversation unto itself. So without getting into that, the PLO had relocated to southern Lebanon. The Israelis wanted to retaliate against various terrorist attacks that the PLO had perpetrated against Israel itself, as well as Israeli citizens abroad. And so it intervened in the Lebanese civil war, which was already ongoing by that point, although had itself been partly instigated because of tension between the PLO and Israel in the mid-70s, which, again, conversation unto itself. So without getting into that, Israel invaded Lebanon, removed the PLO, degraded it, etc., and occupied the region. Now, that dealt with the threat of the PLO, but then, of course, the local Arab population resented occupation by Israel, and so they formed resistance organizations, the most prominent of them being Hezbollah. And after Israel withdrew from the region in the mid-1990s, Hezbollah was able to significantly build its presence in the area to the point where Hezbollah is effectively the government of southern Lebanon. It actually has a more powerful army than the Lebanese army. That is to say, the army of the state that Hezbollah nominally is located in. And Hezbollah is comfortable with that arrangement. They're not looking to take control of the entirety of Lebanon. The people in southern Lebanon are largely Shia Muslim, but the people in the rest of the country tend to be other things, Sunni Muslim, Christian, Druze, etc. So they're not interested in taking over the whole country. They're quite content with being the most powerful faction within the country, since that gives them de facto veto power over much of what the government does in any case. So they don't run Lebanon directly, but indirectly they have an immense amount of power in the political system. And again, they have a massive paramilitary force at their disposal, which, in the event of a civil war, could defeat the Lebanese army, probably pretty readily. Which means that Hezbollah has what's called escalatory dominance, meaning that if there were a tit-for-tat series of reprisals against rival groups in the case of a new civil war, Hezbollah, in the end, would be able to retaliate to a degree that the other parties would not be able to meet. And so everybody knows that, and when everybody knows you have escalatory dominance, that very fact alone is actually a significant form of deterrence against the outbreak of conflict. Since, again, everybody knows if conflict does come, they're going to lose. It may take a while, but eventually they will reach a point where they will not be able to retaliate in kind to the same degree that Hezbollah would be able to against them.
I just pulled up the map of the region just to kind of see Lebanon relative to Israel and the West Bank and so on. And the way that you're describing this, it sounds like Hezbollah and Hamas are both effectively warlords in the region, where they're backed by other people in certain ways, and they have the monopoly on violence in an area, but they're not a national government. And that's one of the things that's tricky about people looking at random takes on Israel versus Palestine on the internet is it's not like Palestine has a national army and it's the national army of Palestine versus the national army of Israel. It's the Israel national army, and then you have these different groups in the region that are all trying to tip the balance in their favor, but none of them are a proper government and a proper military. So it's a very asymmetric relationship in terms of the size of the actors and the types of the actors here.
You're correct in terms of Hezbollah, but in terms of Hamas, it actually does govern the Gaza Strip.
Okay, so Hamas does govern.
Yeah, it is the government of the Gaza Strip. Yeah, I guess I have to get into it in order to kind of contextualize that, because otherwise it's probably going to be confusing. So the Palestinian Authority was the government for Palestine created because of the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. So that existed and continues to exist. It held elections in 2006. Hamas won the elections. They should have become the government. That is to say, they should have taken control of the government. Again, the Palestinian Authority in the Palestinian territories. But Israel rejected the outcome of the election. Hamas, in its charter, basically had originally promised to eradicate Israel, denied Israel's right to exist, and was generally pretty intolerant. There was also a lot of anti-Semitic stuff in there, but that's pretty common for the region, so not that surprising. So the Israeli government, also Hamas refused to recognize any of the treaties that the Palestinian Authority had signed, well, not the PA, that the PLO had signed with Israel, including the Oslo Accords themselves. So Israel did not think Hamas was going to be a good faith negotiator in any peace talks. And they also basically just thought that they were effectively a terrorist group that was going to seize control of the Palestinian territories and launch terror attacks against Israel.
Well, on a human level, I can see why they would be suspicious of them based on what they said about Israel leading into their election.
Yeah. Now, of course, you can also argue that the Israeli government itself, Likud in particular, the right-wing party that was in charge at the time, was itself not a good faith actor, which is most likely also true. In that sense, you could argue that they chose to interpret Hamas's win, Hamas's victory in the election, as an opportunity to disrupt Palestinian politics and create a division, which subsequently is what happened. What happened is that Israel said that they were not going to allow, effectively, Hamas to take control of Palestinian territory, and they then teamed up with the PLO, which was still nominally in control of the Palestinian Authority, in order to push Hamas out of Palestinian territories, to basically crush them as an organization. They were largely successful in the West Bank, but they failed in Gaza. So the result is that Palestine, in so much as it was a cohesive political entity to begin with, became bifurcated. The PLO continued to govern the West Bank under the rubric of the Palestinian Authority there, but Hamas took control of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza.
Interesting. So Hezbollah, more like the warlord entity, more military focused, and Hamas was kind of like an aggressive political entity that was elected, that wasn't fully accepted and has some power but not complete power in the region in terms of administration and military operations, but they do all the military stuff. But they're like limited to a region.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So yes, they are the government of Gaza, but it's also a terrorist group.
Yeah.
And it has killed civilians. Obviously, they've killed civilians.
Well, they're not even like trying to lie about it. They're like openly saying, yeah, we did this, kind of a group.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they're a government, they're a terrorist group, they're a paramilitary organization, they're a charity. I mean, they do a little bit of everything, basically, which is not uncommon for radical groups in the region, certainly, especially Palestine. So frame them how you will. In fact, how people frame Hamas generally says a lot more about them than it does about facts on the ground in Gaza.
Yeah.
Kind of a Rorschach test in that sense.
Yeah, to me, what I've heard is they're, based on their actions, extremely old school and barbaric in terms of how they go about their objectives. Hyper-violent relative to other political entities. Like we have historical ones of, say, Gandhi. No, not in Civ. I know he's aggressive in Civ, but in the main storyline, it was like peace protesting and stuff like that. And there are lots of different ways to go about what your issues are. And that's one of the things that makes it difficult for someone like myself to weigh in on this kind of issue. Is for you to understand fully this issue, you have to go basically back to Bible times. And I don't have that complete knowledge. So I can't tell people what to think about Israel-Palestine. But a lot of people have browsed like an article and a half, and they've got a super firmly made up opinion on what everyone should do and who the good guys and the bad guys are. And they're just going at it, which I think can get people in trouble. Like, it's fair to have your opinion, but it's important to also admit your potential for ignorance and also just lack of understanding about an issue, which is really hard for some people to do, especially if they're trying to appear like the smartest person in the room, which is a very tempting distinction to pursue for many people.
Yeah, a lot of people let their ego do the talking in that sense.
Yeah. Kukio was amazing about that. I've told lots of stories of very high-performing students who were usually getting straight A's, and maybe they came from the TAMS program with me, and they would really try to make sure that they were the smartest person in the room, and Kukyo was like very, very gifted and talented, but also not really interested in proving that he's the smartest in the room. He just wants to learn from people, which made him almost more annoying for them to deal with because he refused their smart kid challenge and just wanted to see what they had to teach him, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a special guy.
Mm-hmm.
I wish he was still around.
Yep. There was a really nice viewer who said that he still is, in the sense of all that he taught us and how we communicate with each other. One of the things that he helped me with a whole bunch is speaking cadence, and how a lot of times you feel like you need to really get your ideas across fast, but he would get his ideas across in a way that no one was left behind, which is kind of how presidents and stuff will be trained to speak. Is you're not speaking for the like fastest, sharpest people in the room. You're speaking so that everyone knows what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So cadence in speech is something that he definitely bestowed upon the world. So yeah, we've got a lot going on in the Middle East. I saw some people saying that Israel was staging a bunch of stuff near the border, but they haven't done any invasion or anything per se yet.
Oh, one last point about Hamas and the PLO. After that 2006 election I mentioned, neither Hamas in Gaza or the PLO in the West Bank ever had an election again.
Oh.
Yeah. So neither one of them really have a democratic mandate at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Likud likes to kind of prey on, exploit that for their own benefit. They point out that there's too much dysfunction in the Palestinian camp to make any kind of substantive peace negotiation or have any substantive peace negotiation. And they also like to point out that, their partners are authoritarian and that Israeli democracy makes Israel a natural partner that the West should be embracing, which is an argument that ignores the Israeli government's culpability in the mess in the first place, of course. Yeah, the rhetoric in the debate within and regarding the Israel-Palestine issue features an immense amount of duplicity by all parties. So I would encourage a great deal of caution for anybody looking to kind of delve into that debate between pro-Palestine and pro-Israel factions in that debate, because there's going to be a lot of obfuscation, probably more obfuscation hidden and embedded in the various arguments that are made than anything substantive. So watch your step. That's very fraught territory. But yeah, you're right. The Israeli army has massed pretty large number of troops along the border with Gaza, but they have not yet started any kind of ground incursion. And I'm still not entirely convinced that they will. One of the features of these little outbreaks of violence between Israel and Palestine is that Israel invariably retaliates, kills a bunch of people, and then eventually international pressure starts to mount. And after a while of that, the United States government generally steps in and says, all right, enough is enough. You need to kind of pull back. And generally that happens under the rubric of a mediated agreement involving the Egyptian government as mediator. More rarely, over the past 5 to 10 years, the United States might do it, but Egypt is probably the more logical choice. So there is kind of a time limit here. The Israeli government, I'm sure, wants to project strength, because it kind of again, I've said this before, but I'll say it again here, the Israeli government feels embarrassed that it kind of allowed this to happen. So it feels a little bit politically vulnerable. And, I'm not saying that politics is the only consideration here. Obviously they're people and whatnot, and they're worried about the safety of their citizens. But realistically speaking, there is a political cost that will be paid if the Israeli government is not seen to be doing enough in response to this, which made it inevitable that they were going to go hard. But the fact that they're going hard also made it inevitable that there would be big international backlash. The Biden administration is running interference for them on that count. And I think the Biden administration has gone out of its way to signal support for Israel, partly itself for its own domestic political reasons, but that is a conversation unto itself. Regardless of the motives, they have been supporting Israel in trying to mitigate diplomatic pressure and fallout from Israeli operations in Gaza. But one of the things I've read about the Biden administration's efforts in that regard is that one of the reasons they're doing that is to build credibility and rapport with the Israeli government so that they can have more pressure to bring to bear later. Because if the Israeli government doesn't feel that the U.S. government is backing them and that it can trust them, it's not going to mean much when the U.S. government eventually does start pressuring them. It'll mean relatively more if the U.S. commitment to Israel is seen as more credible, because going against the United States at that point will be seen as threatening future cooperation and support, which could be critical depending on how things in the region pan out. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the region is very unpredictable, so U.S. support is very valuable to Israel. Mm-hmm. But that value, again, is partly determined and defined by the perceived credibility of the U.S. commitment. So the Biden administration is bolstering that commitment, and probably they're going to cash in those chips in a couple weeks or months in the form of pressure for the Israeli government to tone down the operation or maybe even just stop it entirely. Mm-hmm. So that fact is not lost on anybody. The Israeli government itself is going to recognize that. So I suspect the pressure from the hawks in the Israeli administration is going to be to launch a fast, quick operation that is going to probably incur greater casualties on both sides, including Israel. But the upshot is that they'll be able to accomplish whatever their objectives may be. I'm not entirely sure what those are. Again, you can't really get rid of Hamas per se. The group, you can get rid of Hamas, the government, but the idea, the resistance, the organization is just going to melt into the population, even if they do go hard and get rid of the government. Regardless, they want to get rid of the government at least, I suspect, and they'll try to do that quickly. And hypothetically, that would be possible in a quick operation, although, again, it would be much more violent and come with much more casualties. Now, opposing the hawks is actually, from what I've read, Netanyahu himself. Contrary to what you might think, Netanyahu himself, despite being relatively hawkish in foreign policy outlook, is generally pretty averse to conflict, which is probably a result of the fact that he himself is a veteran. He was in Israel's special forces. And, most people who actually experience war know that it's extremely unpredictable and that it's better avoided if you can. You never want to seem to be willing to trade anything away in order to avoid it. You don't want to look like a pushover because that invites aggression. But at the same time, if you can establish deterrence, after that, it's better not to go on misadventures that are not necessary. It's better to be reserved and cautious in terms of military operations. So Netanyahu seems to be of that mind. And so he seems a little dubious about the prospects and the utility of a ground incursion. Airstrikes are fine. Everybody's on board with that. That's pretty much a consensus issue. But Netanyahu seems to be hesitating on the ground incursion for the moment. Now, it could be that he's convinced by the hawks of the necessity of a ground incursion in order to reestablish some degree of deterrence against Hamas, in order to try to discourage them from trying to do something like what they did at some future date. Debatable whether or not that's really feasible, whether or not you can actually deter them from doing that realistically, but that is another conversation. So that's sort of the debate happening within the Israeli government. I think everybody is assuming right now that a ground incursion is probably inevitable, given the politics, the optics, and the strategy, and the strategic side involved. Again, the need for retaliation and deterrence. But the fact that they haven't done it yet is a little bit telling. Mm-hmm. Obviously, they needed some time to muster troops, gather supplies, plan, gather intelligence, etc. But even so, they could have started earlier if they'd wanted to. And I suspect that the fact that they haven't is indicative that they're still prevaricating over this. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. The consensus opinion now is that it's going to happen and there will be a ground war in Gaza. But I think there's an outside chance it won't. So don't be too surprised if it doesn't come to that. You may find that there is suddenly a magical agreement that comes about. Not a peace agreement, but, a ceasefire of some kind to some degree, in which both parties will have some space to negotiate further regarding issues like hostages and things like energy. The Israeli government, in case you don't know, has cut Gaza off from all energy, electricity, water, gas, etc., that it had been getting from Israel.
Oh, that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, they actually did that a week or two ago, so pretty early on in their retaliation. From the Israeli perspective, that was necessary because all of that stuff was just going towards their enemy. They perceive themselves to be at war with Gaza at this point, and it makes no sense to them to continue to give aid to their opponent.
Yeah, well,
But of course,
as a reminder too for our Americans listening or people who have any similar tragedy from your own home country, we have 9/11 as an American reference of an event where a bunch of innocent, normal working citizens were killed, and how nasty that feels to happen to you. So on an emotional level, I think we can understand that they're going to need to take some defensive precautions on their part because a bunch of their just normal rave people were attacked and killed, and that's pretty insane. So to have them play back at them makes sense. I guess the question is like, what is the extent of what they're going to do? So they're cutting the utilities that they were sending them, and then you're saying that Netanyahu doesn't want a really aggressive counter maneuver, but they need to do something to basically show that you can't do that and set a precedent.
Yeah, they want to illustrate that when Hamas does things like their raid, they can expect a pretty brutal response. So they want to do that in order to have that as deterrence. Hamas could do it again, but it comes with a high price. Yeah, it's not a price in terms of the Palestinian civilians per se. That's going to be an issue, but neither Hamas nor the Israeli government particularly cares about them. They're kind of a side thought. When conflicts like this kind of reach a certain stage, civilian casualties are just par for the course. They kind of cease to be relevant to the strategic calculations. For Israel, a little more relevant just because they need American backing and the United States has to care. So a little bit relevant in that sense. But what the Israeli government is really thinking of here when it thinks about establishing deterrence is Hezbollah. In 2006, Israel fought a war with Hezbollah. Mostly it was a rocket war. Hezbollah lobbed a shit ton of rockets at Israel. Israel retaliated by launching a wave of airstrikes targeting Hezbollah assets, personnel, and other infrastructure in Lebanon. And, Hezbollah kind of claimed victory by the time the conflict ended because they were still able to launch rockets at Israel. The Israelis had tried to destroy their ability to further launch rockets, but they were unable to do so. So that was something of a victory for Hezbollah. However, Hezbollah has gone out of its way to refrain from instigating or initiating a similar conflict ever since. And it turns out that Hezbollah actually, that is to say, the leadership of Hezbollah, was actually really surprised by the degree of destruction the Israeli government was able to bring to bear in retaliation as a result of that conflict. They had been expecting to take some damage, but the Israelis had sufficient intelligence and sufficient capacity to strike at Hezbollah that they were able to wipe out big swaths of the organization and significantly curb their ability to operate for some time. So again, Hezbollah was not deterred from future aggression by the fact that a lot of civilians died in that war. What deterred them, or at least gave them pause to engage in similar activities in future, was the fact that their organization took way more damage than they'd been expecting. So deterrence can be established against paramilitary organizations. That has been done, again, with Hezbollah as the prime example. So that's what the Israeli government is trying to do here with Hamas. Mm-hmm. Now, whether or not that's achievable, whether or not Hamas is comparable to Hezbollah, debatable. I think it's a little bit of a different case study here. Hamas is more embedded in the local population and less strategic minded and much more politically minded than Hezbollah was or is. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's roughly what the Israeli government... You're right. Your description is fairly accurate.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a big mess. Feels pretty bad. It's not really like there's an elegant solution to the problem.
No.
And there's not really a directly peaceful one either, in the sense that Israel basically wants some justice for what happened. And that's the nasty thing about the conflict overall is you can always go back to the previous act of violence and say that they're seeking justice for what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, you could probably go tit for tat one by one all the way back to the 1800s in the case of Israel-Palestine. I don't know enough about the conflict to do that, at least not yet. But hypothetically, it could be done. And I suspect at the end of the day, it wouldn't really matter much because the conflicts evolve. They take on lives of their own over time. And they change in terms of their context and objectives from one generation to the next. So, even if it started one way, that's probably not how it's going to be perceived by the time it's ended. If indeed it does end. But yeah, you were mentioning you had not realized that they had cut off water. Yeah, a lot of Gaza's water and electricity had come from Israel. And one of the justifications the Israeli government has about as far as cutting it off, beyond the fact that they see themselves at war with Gaza, is that Hamas could have, while it was governing Gaza, invested money into infrastructure such that they could have become self-sufficient in water and electricity, such that they wouldn't have had to have imported so much of it from Israel. And they say that the reason they didn't do that is because they took all of that money that they got from taxes and charity and put it into building rockets and other weapons for the paramilitary arm of Hamas as an organization. Now, there's some veracity to that. Hamas has definitely invested substantial resources into building up its weapons arsenal. Mostly unguided rockets, very crudely made. So they could have done more to invest in the public, but at the same time, the reality of the Israeli blockade around Gaza means that even if they had invested in an infrastructure, it probably would have been very difficult for them to build up infrastructure in Gaza to any significant degree, given how hard it is to import stuff of any substantive quality or quantity into the territory. And I would point out, too, that even if Hamas had invested in Gaza to a point where economic conditions became substantively better, to the point where Hamas was a significant positive force for Palestinians in Gaza, economically, as well as politically and socially, that would have no bearing on how the Israeli government treated them, or the trajectory of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or the perspective of the settlers or Likud of Palestinians and of Gaza and Hamas in particular. So it's kind of a red herring in that sense. Again, that's one of those duplicitous sort of sneaky arguments that people make.
So what you're saying is Israel is going to be an opponent regardless of how Hamas acts.
Yeah. Again, part of the reason that Hamas is where it is because Israel de facto encouraged the divide between the PLO and Hamas. The Netanyahu government way back in, what was it? Well, actually, it wasn't the Netanyahu government at the time. It was a conservative government at the time in Israel when the election in 2006 happened. And they could have hypothetically, even in spite of Hamas's charter, given them the benefit of the doubt, given them control of the Palestinian Authority, and then tried to negotiate with them in order to reach a new understanding. Even if they rejected the previous treaties that Israel had signed with the PLO, new arrangements could have been made. And just by institutionalizing Hamas, kind of giving them power, giving them a stake in the status quo, they could have been moderated and brought around, hypothetically, in the event negotiations were held. But as was, the Israeli government at that time chose to rule out negotiations before the fact. Like right from the start, they just said, that's not going to happen. We're not going to do that.
Gotcha.
And so that foreclosed any possibility of any kind of institutionalization or moderation of Hamas, which could have happened. I'm not saying it would have happened. Maybe the Israeli government was right, and the negotiations would have gone exactly nowhere, and Hamas would have just gone on trying to kill people in Israel. But by foreclosing the talks entirely, there's no way we can know that. It's an impossible counterfactual at this point. But the reason that I would be critical of Likud and the Israeli government there is that Likud had already been on the record as saying that they had no real intention of ending the settlements in the West Bank. And they had already made apparent that one of the strategies they wanted to implement was to try to use divide and rule against the Palestinians in order to try to play them off each other, in order to make them look like a less viable partner for peace. The more dysfunctional Palestinian politics is, the less you can kind of blame the Israeli government for failing to negotiate substantively with them with regard to some kind of new peace arrangement with the Palestinians as a people and as a political entity. Now, that's not to say the Palestinians don't have some culpability there. The fact that their politics are dysfunctional and that their main representative bodies are, a terrorist organization in the form of Hamas and a corrupt authoritarian pan-Arab nationalist organization in the form of the PLO, does not speak well of Palestinian politics. It is not a particularly liberal-minded politics in the grand scheme of things. And the dysfunction could have been negotiated away or dealt with more maturely by both the PLO and Hamas, for their part. But as was, they mostly wanted to fight for power instead of negotiate or present a united front against Israel, as the case may have been. Mm-hmm. So everybody had a reason to fuck things up. And so that's what happened. It's not as though one group or the other in particular sabotaged it. It's not as though one group's weaknesses were the critical flaw that sabotaged peace. There's plenty of blame to kind of go around there. Mm-hmm. You could argue that the Israelis kind of should be attributed the bulk of the blame, in so much as they're the most powerful actor in the conflict, and in so much as you think the most powerful actor in a given conflict has the most responsibility for how the conflict is conducted and managed. You could ascribe failures like that more to Israel than the other parties. Mm. But I've seen Israelis respond to that argument by saying it's unreasonable. They argue that being the most powerful combatant in the conflict does not mean they have any kind of special responsibilities. It just means that they're winning and are in a stronger position to protect their people from their opponents and their machinations. Mm. Yeah, keep in mind, the right wing of Israeli politics is very cynical in its world outlook. It has a very dim view about human nature and the inevitability of conflict. So they're not really in the mood, generally speaking, ideologically speaking, to give the counterparty in their conflict the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. That's pretty much never going to happen with them. Their whole outlook is that this is a conflict for control of the land, and we're going to keep it going until we win, somehow. And if that means sitting on the Palestinians until they eventually cave in and negotiate some kind of agreement, that's what we're going to do. I would point out that some of the original intellectuals that are considered the father of the right wing of Israeli politics, were not historically opposed to a peace agreement. They didn't think one was likely in the short term. They thought that conflict was inevitable, and that the Jews, as they were at the time, and later the Israelis, once they became an independent state, needed to present as strong a front as possible in terms of military organization, if not outright violence, in order to make clear that they would not be pushed off the land, and to ensure that there was no expectation that they ever would be. Their thinking was that only if that could be achieved would there ever be substantive peace negotiations. And that's very much colored conservative thinking in Israel regarding the settlements and the Palestinians ever since. Mind you, these intellectuals were writing way back in the early 20th century, so this is way back. But that said, the point I was making is that even given that mindset, they did want a peace agreement. They did want Palestinians and Jews to live together in harmony eventually. They just didn't think it was feasible in the short term. There's still some of that in Likud and other conservative parties. There is this sentiment that they can't take their foot off the pedal. They have to go hard with the Palestinians, but that eventually peace could be achieved, and that would be the optimal endpoint. But there are more and more over time groups that don't think peace is ever going to be possible, and that the only real solution is a kind of expulsion or domination of the Palestinians that continues indefinitely, a kind of permanent violence, so to speak, in the region. Mm-hmm. Which is an even more cynical perspective than the one they already had. But given that perspective, given that that's how they view the conflict, it's no surprise that they're not backing down. It's a negotiated peace of any kind is just outlandish to them on its face, which is why they don't really pursue it seriously. In so much as they have pursued it, they've done it as a token effort in order to appease either peaceniks within Israeli domestic politics or the United States, when the United States has relatively more dovish governments anyway. It was not an issue during the Trump administration. The Trump administration did not pressure them in any substantive way to negotiate with the Palestinians. So that was a non-starter. The Obama administration generally pressured them more, which Netanyahu hated. Relations between the Israeli government and the Obama administration were pretty bad for pretty much the entire 8 years of the Obama administration. No love lost there. So, it kind of differs depending on administration in that sense. So, yeah, have fun untying that diplomatic Gordian knot.
Okay, I'll try to have fun. Seems pretty scuffed. A lot of people are getting very mad about everyone's takes on the subject.
Oh, yeah.
I think that some of it is people really trying to put a really clear good guy and bad guy category for the whole thing. And as you break everything down, it's very clear that there have been massive, long-term mistakes that have been made over the course of, I think, some centuries now. And just some really aggressive refusal to de-escalate and try to moderate views and stuff like that. Because radicalization is something that is also a problem in the region, where people are specifically taught that the outgroup is so bad that they cannot be reasoned with and they cannot be negotiated with. And at that point, you've really kind of ruled out diplomacy as an option on the table, which you didn't necessarily have to before then. But
yeah, unfortunately, when you don't think peace is possible, you don't really take peacing treaties very seriously. Even if that would be optimal. But, like I said last time, there's a difference between ethics and expectations. Ethically speaking, it's pretty dire. That is to say, the status quo in the Israel-Palestine conflict is pretty dire, as well as the perspective and approach politically by Likud, the Israeli government, Hamas, the PLO, etc. But in terms of expectations, everybody is expecting pretty much as I would expect them to. You would expect a resistance organization under sustained pressure to get more and more radical over time. So in that sense, violence by Hamas, up to and including the raid recently, is the expected outcome. But in turn, if you have a group like Likud and conservatives in Israel generally, with the perspective that they have, you would expect them to behave exactly as they have. In terms of sitting on the Palestinians, resisting peace efforts, etc. With that perspective, that's what you would expect them to do. So, everything is pretty much as it, not should be, that's kind of normative, but everything is going as you would expect two parties of this degree of stubbornness and outlook to behave and interact. So unfortunately, this is, however unstable it may look from the outside, an equilibrium. It's a very violent equilibrium, arguably a very unethical equilibrium. But that's where we are.
I think
that's why
inarguably.
Oh, yeah, inarguably.
Yeah.
But that's why I think that this time next year, it'll probably be back to status quo. Even with all of the drama, eventually they're just going to go back to the, usual tit for tat retaliatory killings that flare up and flare down at unpredictable intervals, albeit regular intervals.
So there's a whole lot going on there. We'll see how that develops. Were there any other... Oh, there was something about a Palestinian hospital getting hit with something, but then some people said it was a parking lot, and some people said it wasn't a parking lot.
Yeah, here's my advice. Just when it comes to Israel-Palestine, just don't bother with social media, like at all. It just, the social media coverage of Israel-Palestine is now, and pretty much always has been, abysmal. The immediate approach to coverage of the issue on social media, in any given incident, if not just in terms of the broader interpretation of the issue generally, can best be described as a form of catastrophizing. Invariably, everybody catastrophizes everything that happens constantly in the conflict. I can give you an example of from the raid itself that Hamas perpetrated recently. So, there was footage of a woman, an Israeli woman who had been captured by Hamas, and she was being taken out of the back of a car, and then she was being moved to one of the side seats. And in the video footage, you can see that she has some kind of dark spot on her bottom, right? And it wasn't clear what that was. She had wounds on other parts of her body, and, other dark splotches. It looked like something wet basically was on her. And rather than saying, I don't know what that is, a lot of people said, oh, that's blood because she was raped. And so then people started going around posting in comments and on social media in particular that Hamas is raping women in Israel. And later on, that became Israel has captured multiple women. We know, quote unquote, that they're raping women. So then people started posting about Hamas gang raping women. And so then it came out that Hamas was killing civilians in Israel. So then it became Hamas is gang raping and murdering women. And then it became Hamas is gang raping, torturing, and murdering women. And that just became the norm. That became the narrative, so to speak, amongst a lot of people very quickly after the raid. And later on, it became apparent that the only source for any of that was that one video in which nobody is being raped, murdered, or tortured. Now, I can't say for certain that she wasn't raped, murdered, or tortured, but the video in and of itself is not really sufficient evidence to extrapolate that. I know people in Israel hate Hamas, mistrust them, and assume the worst of them to the point where they assume implicitly that if Hamas militants are running around killing people, they're probably also raping them. That's not necessarily bad logic. It would not surprise me if they had. But my point here is that this video alone sparked a wave of catastrophizing that spilled out into a whole narrative of atrocities just by itself. Like, one video was all it took. And after that, everybody was off to the races. So this hospital thing is kind of similar to that. People said that Israel blew up a hospital. And then people said that because, Hamas basically released information. They showed images of a damaged hospital. And Hamas itself said that 500 people were killed. So then it came out later that it wasn't the hospital itself that was struck. It was actually the parking lot in front of the hospital that was struck. And then it came out that it may not have been an Israeli airstrike at all. Maybe it was just a rocket of some kind. And then it came out that 500 people had not died, that the casualties were actually much more mild, and that the hospital itself had barely been damaged. And now it's been suggested that actually the rocket in question was probably Hamas itself. Hamas has continuously been firing rockets into Israel since the conflict started, a couple weeks ago. So the thinking here, and this is actually not unprecedented, so this is actually a pretty reasonable interpretation. Hamas rockets have a pretty high failure rate because, again, they're basically just homemade rockets. They make them underground using spare parts that they're able to smuggle through the Israeli blockade of Gaza. So they're not sophisticated munitions. So the failure rate is relatively high. And when they fail, generally they fall short of their intended target, Israel, and fall in Palestinian territory, specifically into Gaza. So what happened here, most likely, is that one of these rockets that Hamas fired, which was intended to fall into Israeli territory, suffered some kind of mechanical failure, fell short, and then landed in the hospital's parking lot. Honestly, mechanical failures like that probably happen fairly frequently. Obviously, most of them are able to hit Israel, or at least are able to make it across the border into Israeli airspace. But most of the time, the duds, the ones that fail probably are falling out in the countryside. They're blowing up trees, grass, and cows, and nobody really cares about them. So you don't hear about those.
Animal rights activists do care about the cows, but
I would concede that. But strategically speaking, in terms of news media coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the cows do not get pole position in terms of coverage.
correct.
Yeah. So occasionally, very rarely, one of these rocket failures falls into a populated area and blows up a house, some people, whatever. In this case, a hospital parking lot. And when that happens, pretty much always without fail, Hamas will come out and say that it was an Israeli airstrike.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a fairly established pattern. So I'm not saying that there is 100% certainty here that the Israelis did not launch some kind of munition that ended up hitting a hospital parking lot. I don't have enough evidence to say that conclusively. But Hamas rockets suffering mechanical failure is something that happens regularly whenever these flare-ups happen. So that's the most believable scenario to me.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's one of the reminders for people. We talked about this a bunch during the start of the war in Ukraine, but both sides have a heavy incentive to twist the narrative in a way that makes them look out to be on the right side and also the victim of stuff. So just be aware of that these groups have an objective of some kind, and it's not really possible to browse perfectly unbiased news. Every news source is going to have a bias of some kind. And especially for spicy stuff like this, a lot of people, like we've talked about with just the general polarization of news, a lot of people are really hyping up and making stuff more clickbaity in terms of titles, which can deceive people about the intensity of any given individual issue. And then there's also the telephone game that happens. It starts with some simple report like there was a rocket that almost hit a hospital to after 18 people passed on the story, it's like there was a rocket that blew up a complex of 8 hospitals. And that's just people making a story into a tall tale. And that's been a problem with news pretty much since the origins of language. But with this kind of stuff, you can't really just see one article and then feel like you know everything that's going on and you understand it. Especially because the one article that you read may just be completely wrong, or it could be flawed or heavily biased in some way. You need to be able to understand why, who the actors are, what their motivations are, that sort of deal.
Yeah. And that's hard to do when both parties don't really want to give you full access.
Mm-hmm.
In general, both the Israeli government and Palestinian resistance organizations of one kind or another focus very hard on controlling their media representation. That is to say, their representation in media. PR is a very important front in the conflict, at least in the minds of the participants. And so controlling media, controlling access to facts on the ground, all of that is considered a big part of their, what you might call, information warfare.
Mm-hmm.
So as you say, that very much inhibits the ability to trust basically anything they say at face value, especially when there's ongoing violence.
Yeah. Yep, so stay safe out there and don't bet too much on any of the random news that you read. There was mention of the war in Ukraine recently. We haven't had an update that on there in a while, I guess. Has anything different been happening?
Let me check my notes. I've still been keeping them. I don't think the status quo has shifted that much. Ukraine's offensive is ongoing, but it hasn't made a whole lot of progress. And the expectation is that Rasputitsa is going to hit before it is able to achieve any kind of substantive objectives. For those of you not familiar with Rasputitsa, that's basically the muddy season in Ukraine, if not the region in general. And when the rains come, the ground gets so muddy that it's very difficult to move around. If the roads are passable, you can use them, but you're pretty much restricted to the roads, which very much limits your ability to maneuver. And in many places, roads are sufficiently bad that they themselves become extremely unnavigable on account of the mud and rain during this period. So it was expected and known that the offensive pretty much had to achieve any of its core objectives before the rainy season started. And that does not seem likely to happen. I think it's going to start soon if it hasn't already in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But for the moment, they're still fighting, last I checked. And I think the most recent development as far as the fighting in southern Ukraine was recent news that Ukrainian forces had crossed the Dnieper River and supposedly had taken up positions on the east bank. Whether or not they're able to expand those beachheads, well, I shouldn't say beachhead, bridgeheads, let's say, on the other side of the river remains to be seen. It could just be a diversionary tactic to try to pull Russian forces away from Zaporizhia. Could also just be something they're doing for PR to show that they're still trying to take back the rest of Kherson province. But it could be a substantive effort to try to retake territory. Anybody's guess right now. I don't know. But that'll be something to keep an eye on in the short term. Let's see. Other than that, I think in the east of Ukraine, there's been renewed fighting. The Russians are trying to push on Advivka. I can never remember.
Yeah, that's what I was just asking about.
Yeah, so there's the capital of Donetsk province, Donetsk Oblast, is a city called Donetsk. And there's a suburb, I guess, or maybe a village northwest of Donetsk called Avdiivka. And the Russians are trying to encircle it. Mm-hmm. And they've been trying to do it off and on basically since the conflict kind of solidified along its current lines. But recently, over the past month, they've been making a renewed effort there. And they've got it encircled on 3 sides right now. So it's looking like they're making some progress there. But it's not clear if they'll be able to actually close it off entirely and fully encircle the city. So, there's some attention being paid to that. The Russians have been making slow progress. It's very much a mirror image of the offensive in Zaporizhia in that sense. Whenever either Ukraine or Russia has launched a major offensive in the past year, it's almost invariably been a very slow, grinding affair. So that's very much the case around Avdiivka. So we'll see what happens there. I mean, even if they encircle it, it's not the end of the world. Probably the Ukrainian army would withdraw from the city before it was fully encircled if they thought they were in danger of being fully encircled. But who's to say? But again, it's not a major strategic blow for Ukraine to lose this one town. The areas these offensives by either the Russians or the Ukrainians are fighting over are actually very small. Mm-hmm. So their ambition is very much narrowed from the heady early days of the conflict when the Russians were sweeping through broad swaths of Ukraine. Or from later in the conflict when the Ukrainians themselves were able to seize broad swaths of Kharkiv province on the back of a very weak and hollowed out Russian position there. At this point, it seems like any kind of advance is going to be slow and incremental and very much elongated across a long period of time. Yeah, there's also been fighting in the northeast around Kupiansk, but the Russians have made even less progress there. I don't think the line has really even moved that much. So that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Yeah, I think the biggest news beyond just the front line and shifts there was that supposedly Ukraine has received, I think people call them ATACMS. It feels like a weird way to pronounce that acronym, but I guess that's what it's supposed to be called. ATACMS are the Army Tactical Air Cruise Missile, if I'm not mistaken, something to that effect. Basically, it's the U.S. Army's cruise missile of choice. It's the one that they designed specifically for their own usage. It is a long-range munition, guided as you would expect.
What's it called again? It's an ATACM? Why is it called an ATACM? Well, you attack them. Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, the U.S. military loves its cutesy acronyms.
Yeah.
So it has an exceptionally long range relative to any of the long-range munitions that Ukraine has received up until this point, and they've been asking for them for a long time. With the range of a cruise missile like that, they could hit targets pretty much all the way. They could pretty much hit any target in occupied Ukraine. Let me put it like that. Possibly including some targets fairly deep into Russia itself. So the implications of allowing Ukraine to attack targets within Russia kind of led the Biden administration to hesitate at sharing them. They gave them other missiles. The UK gave them Storm Shadow missiles, which were fairly long range, but not as long range as ATACMS.
Also, very cool name.
Very cool name. Very well named missile.
Storm Shadow missile, very badass.
Yeah. But even so, Ukraine wanted more range because they wanted to hit more and more logistical targets, as well as command and control targets deeper in the Russian rear. Because one of the things that the Russian army did in response to the precision strikes that the Ukrainians laid out on their logistical supply chain, as well as their command and control infrastructure, was to withdraw that infrastructure further and further from the front line. So by giving them longer range munitions, you can force them to go even further back, which comes with trade-offs that are favorable to Ukraine. Or you can force them to disperse closer to the front line, which comes with its own trade-offs. So obviously the Ukrainian army wanted to do that. The US government vacillated for probably a year or so. But then a month or two ago, the Biden administration announced that actually we're going to give them to them. They didn't say when, they didn't say how many, but they did say, okay, this is going to happen now. And they were very cagey about the time frame, but supposedly there is evidence now that there are ATACMS in Ukraine. And there's also an allegation that they've even been used already. Now, that's all kind of gray right now, but given how cagey the US government has been about sharing munitions with Ukraine, I suspect that's part of the game plan. One of the ways that the Biden administration has tried to mitigate the risk of the conflict escalating beyond Ukraine and encompassing Europe and the United States is by slow-boating sharing of resources. Obviously, the Ukrainians hate that. It would probably be better strategically and tactically if the United States just kind of gave them everything they wanted now rather than just giving it to them incrementally as a slow-motion escalation of U.S. involvement. But I think the Biden administration feels that that's necessary in order to foreclose any possibility of escalation with Russia itself. Not even just with the United States per se, but in terms of Russian escalation within Ukraine. There's not a whole lot Russia can do within Ukraine to escalate even further than they already have. But there are things they could do, like do more to target Western supplies coming in from the west of the country. Mostly they focus on the east of the country. They possibly could even target supplies in Poland that come across the border or something like that. So there are things that Russia could do to escalate the conflict beyond Ukraine in a way that does not necessarily involve the United States, but which would be of concern to the United States. Mm-hmm. So for those reasons, the Biden administration has been taking it easy. They've been very slow, incremental, and methodical in terms of the escalation of U.S. support over time. So that's unfortunate in some ways, but the benefit is that there is less risk. And I would add that that benefit is not only risk in terms of strategic risk, the risk of actually getting the United States involved in the conflict with Russia, but it also mitigates political risk. Because if there were an escalation, it would probably be very unpopular. And, there's already growing disenchantment and discontent with the degree and amount of U.S. aid to Ukraine. Not necessarily the fact that the U.S. is supporting Ukraine at all. That's still much more popular, but there are more and more people who are a little wary, I should say, of the sum total of U.S. support for Ukraine. So in order to ensure that those actors in U.S. politics are not needlessly agitated, that support has been slow and incremental for that reason as well. So we'll see if they actually have them and are actually using them. I suspect they probably are, and we'll just hear about it later in order to kind of offer it as a fait accompli to Russia, basically. If the United States came out and said, we're going to give Ukraine attack-them cruise missiles, and we're going to do it by such and such a date, and we're going to allow them to target anything and everything in either Ukraine or Russia, that gives the Russian government a significant incentive to retaliate to some degree in order to deter future such shipments, as well as to try to stop in order to stop the United States from delivering on that promise to deliver attack-ums. But by being cagey and obfuscating, the timetable and being unclear, there's not any one single thing the Russian government has to retaliate against in terms of an announcement or a shipment or a given attack. Basically the United States hints that it'll give them, and then they just magically appear at some point. And at that point, it's too late for the Russian government to do anything to really retaliate. So that muddies the waters, strategically speaking, in terms of the game theory that the Russian government is facing. And it makes a given retaliation that escalates the conflict with the United States or with an American ally like Poland or just in Eastern Europe generally less appealing strategically. So, the approach is not without its merit. I don't want to rag on the Biden administration too much on that count. It does have its plus side. It's just unfortunate that the trade-off is that the Ukrainian army is not getting as much equipment as quickly as it needs, and is not getting as capable or effective equipment as quickly as it needs. So we'll see what the fallout is there. Let's see. I think those are the main highlights as far as Ukraine. There's an election in Poland, but that was mostly just political theater. I wouldn't read too much into that. China put some restrictions on its drones. Supposedly, those restrictions will also encompass Russia, but I don't think anybody believes that's actually going to work. So most likely, if China does restrict export of its drones, that's going to disproportionately impact Ukraine. Most of the drones, at least the small commercial drones that Ukraine uses, are actually Chinese, somewhat ironically. But if China does use this as an excuse to cut off Ukraine, that could put them in something of a bind. I suspect, and maybe this is also a little bit ironic given all the talk about the ineffectual nature of Western sanctions targeting Russia, I suspect that Chinese commercial drones will probably, even if China tries to stop them going to Ukraine, will still find their way to Ukraine anyway, and probably still in substantive numbers. Because China is ultimately going to find that it's just as difficult for them to impose and implement sanctions against Ukraine as it is for the West to do the same against Russia. The problem being, of course, the re-export market. Maybe China will not sell drones directly to Ukraine or Russia, but they'll still sell them to, say, Brazil or the UAE or India or Turkey. Turkey probably is the most relevant here. And if they're going to sell them to Turkey, well, what's to stop Turkish actors from selling them on to Ukraine and Russia? Now, maybe the Chinese government has restrictions in place to try to make buyers promise not to re-export like that, but China has even less capability to enforce provisions like that than the United States does. So the reality is that most likely this announcement was made to try to appease the Russian government in order to make a token effort to try to help them. But the actual impact is probably going to be near zero, I would expect. Political theater really is one of the defining characteristics of this current era that we're in. It's always been relevant, but I don't think it's ever been more relevant than in the 2020s. Let's see, there's been some gas shortages in Russia, but that mostly has to do with price controls. That was kind of dumb of them. I don't know why they felt that necessary. So they put a price cap in place. There are shortages. It's as predictable as the rainfall in that sense. So they've been kind of dealing with that, but it should be manageable. One of the things I found interesting about that is one of the contributing causes to the shortage is that it was actually, because of the price caps, it actually made more sense to export. Diesel fuel in particular is what they're short of. It actually made more sense economically to export diesel fuel than to keep it and sell it within Russia. And so that was one of the inadvertent side effects of the price cap. I would expect shortages regardless, but the fact that they were able and apparently did export significant quantities of diesel fuel to the point where there were shortages, kind of illustrates the difficulty that Russia itself has in managing its economy, even during a period of emergency, such as the one that they're in. Administrative capacity is very important, is the point I'm making here. It's not enough just to say, I'm going to deal with this shortage by imposing a price cap to ensure that people are not price gouged. You do have to try to think of everything, so to speak. So, export restrictions would have been necessary before they did that, but it seems that was not the case. To be fair, containing the impact of price caps would be difficult even for the United States. And we don't have to wonder what that would look like. We actually tried to do that in the 1970s, when the federal government actually put price caps on the price of gasoline here in the United States in response to the energy emergency, that being caused by a massive increase in the price of oil, caused by intermittent embargoes by the Saudis in response to the Yom Kippur War, and then again after and during 1979 in response to the Iranian Revolution. So the impact was predictable, right? There were just shortages. And because there were shortages, there were massive lines around gas stations. Everybody from the 70s can tell you about the gas lines at the time. They were one of the memorable features of the decade. So even Washington, with all of its administrative capacity, struggled with that. And they tried to do other little things here and there, but the reality is that price caps pretty much are an immutable force. That is to say, shortages are an immutable force in response to price caps. It's very difficult to prevent that from happening. Let's see. I guess those are the main things. I think Europe is on track to have enough natural gas for the winter, it looks like, and probably, I can't say for sure, but probably it's going to be another warm winter, right? Just kind of given the way the climate's been. So that'll probably help them.
It wasn't a crazy heat wave this year, at least for where I live, compared to the previous couple of years, but could just be a lull, and then it gets crazy again.
Yeah, we'll see. But for now, having warm winters is definitely helpful because it means they don't consume as much natural gas. Mm-hmm. And that helps ease energy prices in Europe because it means there's less demand for natural gas. And it also means there's less need to ration what natural gas is available, such that the industry doesn't get as much as it needs. So I have been reading some concern about Europe's prospects for procuring enough natural gas in storage in preparation for winter. But it seems that issue has been handled. Mm. So in so much as that's relevant to European support for Ukraine, that's a positive.
Good to know.
I don't think we ever talked about the collapse of the grain deal, did we?
That sounds familiar. I don't know how deep we got into it.
Well, basically, Ukraine is a major grain exporter, but Russia blockaded their coast. That created big issues in world grain markets. And so eventually a deal was reached by which there was a trade corridor of sorts by which Russia would allow commercial shipping to come in, dock in Ukraine, and pick up Ukrainian grain for export, which they could then sail out through the same corridor by which they came in. And so that helped ease pressure on grain markets, but it also, from the Russian perspective, had the downside of enabling their opponent to make a lot of money that they need for their war effort. So that trade-off was considered acceptable for a long time, but eventually talks break down. I mean, the deal that was agreed invariably had a sunset clause. Sunset clause that had to be renegotiated. And I think they did that once or twice, but eventually the talks failed. And so the grain agreement was canceled, and then grain markets spiked again. People complained, and it wasn't clear at that point what the path forward was. So it seemed that the Russian blockade was back in force. But then commercial ships came in and sailed through the blockade anyway, and were able to dock and bring Ukrainian grain out. So the status quo there is ambiguous, it seems. I think eventually there was some new agreement that was somewhat less ambitious in scope. But things were definitely looking a little hairy there for a while, especially in the Middle East, which had, before the conflict, imported much of their grain needs from Ukraine and Russia. I would point out, too, that in response to the collapse of the deal initially, Russia responded by bombing grain silos in Ukraine.
That doesn't make sense.
Well, I mean, grain is an important part of their economy, so, you're undermining them in that sense. It's a strategic asset, you could say.
Yeah, I guess short term.
But that certainly pissed off a lot of people in the Middle East, which, wanted to eat that food, understandably. And of course, people in Ukraine argued that it was civilian targets that they were going after. Mm-hmm. And, blowing up grain silos is just kind of a bad look generally, even beyond the context of the conflict. It's not a good look. It's very bad optics to grow up shit tons of food, literal shit tons, you could say, of food. So in that sense, Russia was kind of on the back foot in terms of the media narrative, you might say. So in so much as that was a factor, it may have contributed to them kind of paring those efforts back a little bit and eventually renewing to some new replacement agreement.
Chat asks randomly, how bad will these volcanoes in Italy erupting be?
I don't know. I didn't even know they were erupting. Shows what I know. I know the prime minister broke up with her boyfriend, but I have not heard about the volcanoes. That's a new one on me. I guess that's what I get for not paying more attention to geological developments. That's
Prime
on
minister
me.
broke up with her boyfriend, but did the volcano break up with their boyfriend too? Maybe that's why it's upset.
Yeah, for those of you who don't remember, Italy has a, right-wing, shall we say, prime minister in power. The reason that I add the air quotes there is that the party that she's a member of used to be a fascist organization. And they've since eschewed that background, but you know how it is with groups that used to be fascist. Nobody ever really is willing to give them a full benefit of the doubt. Everybody kind of gives them a suspicious look and assumes that they're not being entirely honest about the degree to which they've really parted with some of that fascist ideology. So everybody was kind of interested and not a little bit concerned about what she would do once she was in power. She's actually been fairly moderate overall. She hasn't done anything particularly dramatic. But given the drama around her and her party and just Italian politics in general, I was kind of surprised to read about her in the news in an article that was, in a way, regarding an issue that was just very mundane. People were worried about fascism returning to Italy, and instead there's an article about her breaking up with her boyfriend.
Yeah.
So as far as outcomes go, that's probably the preferred outcome if I had to choose between the two. I'll take celebrity gossip type out headlines in lieu of, death camps and whatnot. Yeah. So fairly positive in that sense.
Lesser of two evils.
Yeah. So I'll take that. But yeah, her boyfriend apparently is a media personality and sort of the right-wing ecosystem of Italy's media. But apparently he was caught on tape being extremely sexist, like trying to have sex with coworkers, kind of belittling women generally, making sexist jokes. It was all pretty damning overall. So it seems that was enough to lead the prime minister to just announce a separation. Now, maybe she did that for political reasons, who's to say? But I did read that it was likely to boost her popularity. For what that's worth. Well, I mean, she could have stood by him. She could have made excuses.
No, I know that makes sense. I was saying that's weird.
But she did kind of pull the plug there.
So she broke up with him as a result of this thing, which I would guess that's just his behavior a lot of the time. So she probably knows more about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Misogyny, I think, is part of the general concept of what he's doing.
Yeah, and Italy in particular has kind of a reputation for that. So it's not necessarily shocking per se.
Yeah,
but
Italy and then a lot of the other Latin American countries also have a strong culture of machismo, where it's about the guy being tough and a badass and honestly also a slut, and that being like a plus side of like, look at how many chicks I get kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. I would point out that's not only a Latin thing, that's actually a Mediterranean thing, because you can see the same phenomena in North African countries.
Ah.
If not also in the Levant, although, I don't know, the Levant is such a clusterfuck, I find it difficult to paint it with any single brush, so I would hesitate to ascribe them the same features. But North Africa, I'm more confident about. I have read that they share pretty much the same view and perspective of women culturally and actually behave in very similar ways, regardless of the society in question.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, good luck, Italy.
So I don't think that the breakup has any real meaning politically, but yeah, when they mentioned Italy, that was the first thing that came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
But good luck to all the people threatened by the volcanoes. Stay safe, I guess.
Mm-hmm. We don't really have volcanoes in mainland U.S. after Mount St. Helens in Washington, which that was right around, I think, right before I was born.
Early 80s, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a guy, a photographer, who was fairly close to the mountain when it erupted.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than running, he actually just kept taking pictures. And then when the pyroclastic flow reached him, he just huddled down in a fetal position and tried his best to protect the camera and the pictures he'd taken.
Mm-hmm.
And he was actually successful. So we actually have pictures of the eruption happening and the pyroclastic flow approaching, very close to the mountain again.
Did he live?
Oh, hell no. He very much did. He literally died for his craft.
Wow.
Which is why I mentioned it. You know, it's a fairly impressive guy. I mean, he probably was going to die anyway. He was so close to the mountain that the pyroclastic flow was probably going to incinerate him.
I thought you were about to say because he was so old or something.
Well, not necessarily old, but, you know, there just wasn't anywhere to run or hide at that point. So, you know, he probably recognized that and figured that if he was going to die, he might as well take some legendary pictures while he was doing it.
That's the very way of the samurai right there. Damn.
Yeah. And he did. You know, I don't remember his name, but, you know, maybe people can Google around and find some of him and some of his pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we don't have any active volcanoes here in the U.S., but we do have some huge-ass dormant ones.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one big one in Southern California, I think. And then, of course, Yellowstone also. Technically, Yellowstone is a super volcano, if I'm not mistaken.
It's a super volcano.
Yeah, that's much, much larger than just like a regular volcano is basically a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
But super volcanoes can encompass whole regions.
Oh.
Yeah, so like a big chunk of Wyoming and basically the states around Yellowstone Park, like almost maybe half of those states, all told, is encompassed by the supervolcano under Yellowstone.
Whoa.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, historically speaking, the record of the damage done by supervolcanoes when they go off is pretty apocalyptic. Mm-hmm. It's been a long time since one has gone off, but the historical record shows that I think the last one was Toba, maybe, if I'm not mistaken. And the Toba eruption is thought to have wiped out every human on Earth save for about 6,000 or 60,000, something like that. Very small number, basically. Mm-hmm. An extinction level event. If it happened again, it would be pretty bruising, suffice to say.
Yeah, I don't know too much about volcanoes. I know Hawaii has a bunch because they're basically a formation from volcanoes that are under the ocean.
Wasn't there a geology streamer that you had on once?
Yes. Rocket Sage does like geology stuff.
Yeah, I remember seeing that once. It's pretty interesting. I never would have thought there'd be a geology stream on Twitch, but there you go.
Yeah, there are actually quite a few different scientific and educational channels. They aren't usually the ones that make the headlines on Twitch. Usually those are going to be like your Italy story, more the gossip-oriented stuff.
Ah, gotcha.
Gossip and drama and hot takes. That's what gets to the front. Calmly stated facts? Nah. People sleep. Actively having freakouts of relationship betrayals? Real shit. For a lot of the viewership. So.
Well, so it goes, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess that's why Entertainment Weekly still has an ongoing television show.
Mm-hmm.
They've been on for as long as I can remember. Was there anything else that kind of caught your eye recently?
Let me see. I think we covered all the stuff that chat mentioned before we started. Oh, I did have a just general question of, we kind of talked about this with regards to Russia invading Ukraine, of like the countries that stated approval for one side or the other, or like who they're backing. I heard that pretty much all the countries, like Western countries, are trying to state support for Israel in some way. Is there like an official list of that, or any notable countries that spoke up or countries that stayed quiet for some reason?
I haven't seen any. I would have to look up who does or does not, kind of vocally support Israel. I think in general, yeah, probably most European governments, if not all of them, have explicitly come out and condemned Hamas's attack and said that they support Israel. But a lot of that is kind of cheap talk that doesn't really mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
It basically just means that they're going to understand that there's going to be Israeli retaliation. So they won't complain too much about it. But I also don't think it means that there's any fundamental shift in Europe's foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel, which is complicated, as with so much relevant to Israel. In general, Europe wants to pressure Israel to end the settlements and to come to some kind of permanent peace settlement with the Palestinians. And so the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and what's the S? I forget. Well, basically, the boycott movement targeting Israel is much more powerful in Europe than in the United States. And so that tends to make its way more into a lot of government policy, if not at the national level, then generally at the local or regional level within European Union countries. So on the one hand, they do support Israel. They don't want to condone terrorist attacks, but there's a lot of public sentiment in favor of the Palestinians. And the official government position, well, the official position of European governments is mostly, to my understanding, to encourage and incentivize and to gently pressure, nudge, if you will, Israel towards a peace agreement. But while that's the official line, they also don't really do a whole lot. Well, they don't do as much as they could in actually pursuing that. In effect, they say that that's their priority, but they don't put much weight behind it. So in general, status quo ante, that is to say normal relations with Israel, is the actual real policy of European governments towards Israel. Most everything else is political theater to varying degrees to appease political sentiment within the European public. And then, of course, there's Germany, which adds the extra complicating dimension there. It's Europe, and the people of Europe want to help the Palestinians. But Germany kind of can't do that for obvious reasons.
Oh, yeah, right, because of the past. Yeah.
That it kind of puts them in an awkward position. So the German government in particular tends to support Israel publicly and to give them resources. And I think they've even helped fund a special money fund that goes towards survivors of the Holocaust. So the German government officially supports Israel and backs them more or less unequivocally. But they've also issued some statements that are critical of the settlements and kind of gently prodding them, saying, well, maybe something could be worked out, kind of, sort of. But those statements are always very weak. Mm-hmm. And so the German government basically has to hide any kind of, well, I shouldn't say hide. The German government cannot manifest honestly and accurately the full degree of support within German society for the Palestinians, of which there is, I think, a fairly considerable amount. You know, Germany, like the rest, Germany is not so different from the rest of Europe in that sense. But the German state in particular cannot really voice that for political reasons. And those political reasons are generally supported. You know, that position by the German government to not really say too much critical of Israel is generally supported by the broader part of the German public, as I understand it, such that even people who support the Palestinians don't really want the German government to be too critical in that sense. It's not to say they don't want the German government to allow actors within Israel to take more action in support of the Palestinians at a local level, or certainly at a non-state level. So that's Germany. So the gap between the German government and the people is broader than the gap between European governments and their respective publics. But regardless, the gap is generally fairly large because nobody actually wants to do anything substantive about Israel-Palestine because the issue is complicated and nobody really expects to be able to do anything of great substance about it. Mm. So people make their announcements, they posture either for Israel or against Israel. Generally, it's the government's doing the for Israel posturing, and it's public interest groups or parties that are doing the pro-Palestinian posturing. But ultimately, none of the posturing really amounts to actual substantive assistance or changes in policy, such that the status quo can be expected to substantively change, at least not regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
You're saying that random citizens in countries around the world firing off hot takes on social media is not helping people on the ground?
Correct.
Oh my God! We've been doing it all wrong.
Yeah, you know, I give credit where credit's due. The boycott movement has had some success in pressuring Israel. Kind of like with ESG in the environmental realm, you know, trying to divert investment money away from Israel and in particular the settlements is helpful. It does represent a form of pressure that regular people can bring to bear without the assistance of governments, which again are kind of prevaricating on their actual Israel policy. But that said, there's only so much you can do with that. Mm. You know, it's just not sufficient in and of itself to really move the needle as far as how the Israelis are treating the Palestinians. So that's just kind of stuck in place for the moment. Mm-hmm. So it goes.
Random question from the chat. Does your friend know anything about the Byzantine Empire?
Yes. But keep in mind, anything can encompass a very small amount of information. I know, for example, that the Byzantine Empire had its capital in Constantinople. Ergo, yes, I do know something about the Byzantine Empire. How much more beyond that? Debatable. It was largely a Greek empire. Greek was the lingua franca. I think Latin was still the language of government and the elites in the early part of the empire, but I think in the latter centuries it had transitioned back to Greek. But I cannot speak authoritatively on that matter because the Byzantine Empire is not a historical subject that I've invested a whole lot into over my life. So I can talk about it a little bit, but not a whole lot.
Gotcha. Some people in chat saying, I read a book on it. Yeah, it's an interesting one that doesn't get remembered quite as much these days, but was fairly powerful for its time.
Well, it was the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, the eastern branch of it, or at least in the region.
Yeah, so people talk about the Roman Empire like it died, you know, in the 400s, and that Rome fell and that the whole thing just was a historical memory, but it lived on. You know, the Roman Empire actually did continue to exist. It just did not have its capital in Rome anymore. But of course, its decline was pretty sharp after a certain point. What, probably after the year 800, maybe 900, something around there. It was never really relevant after that. Pretty much continuously losing territory until the Ottomans were able to take it. And what was it, 1450 that Constantinople fell? I'd have to look it up. I don't quite remember. I want to say mid 1400s. But yeah, I think even in the 200, 300 years before the fall of Constantinople, Byzantine territory had shrunk to the point where it was barely an empire. It had shrunken considerably. I think there was a brief renaissance in like 700 AD, thereabouts. Sorry, I'm supposed to say CE, aren't I?
Doesn't matter that much. People know what you mean.
Yeah, AD is just easier.
I haven't actually met anyone who got butt mad that used the wrong one of those, so credit to people who are patient with each other and consistently updating to the most optimal for all that stuff. Common era versus what, after
death?
Yeah.
Or is it Latin?
It's probably Latin for after death or whatever, but it's like before Christ, after Christ is basically what it means. Which is a very Christian-oriented way of telling time. I'll admit that. For me, I get the nostalgia of I was raised Christian, so that delineation makes sense to me. Like, it's the Messiah that was prophesied in the Bible for thousands of years, so it would make sense that you'd be excited about that and make it a major landmark in how time is written and calculated and so on. For those curious, I'm not currently practicing Christian, but I do go to church with family sometimes.
How did we get on that?
Someone asked if you knew anything about the Byzantine Empire.
Right.
And then Christianity, you talked about dates. You said AD instead of CE.
Oh yeah, it's the Roman Empire. That was the point. Yeah, and then the 300 years prior, it deteriorated significantly. It had a brief renaissance around 700 AD. I think that was under Justinian. If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there was. Have you ever heard of Belisarius?
No.
He was a great general of the Byzantine Empire during that period of Justinian's rule when the empire was ascendant. And under his leadership, the Byzantine army was very nearly able to reconstitute the Roman Empire in its entirety. In other words, they almost conquered all of the former Roman territories in North Africa and Italy itself.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, he made it pretty far, but in the end, it wasn't enough. And Belisarius, in particular, because of his exploits, had become popular enough to be seen as a threat by the emperor. And Byzantine politics was, if you don't know, extremely violent. So the last thing you want to do is become popular politically, because that meant you had a target on your back. Yeah, once you reached a certain threshold of popularity in the Byzantine political scene, you pretty much either had to kill the emperor or be killed by the emperor. Those were your choices. Yeah, that political dysfunction, the constant killing of emperors and usurpations and revolutions, is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, the empire entered a terminal decline from whence it never recovered.
You're saying systematically just killing your opposition has some downsides to it for your country for the long term?
But it were otherwise, but yeah.
Wow. It's Chad saying, let's kill our most impactful citizens. Yeah, that's a bad move. Pretty bad move.
Well, such was politics at the time. Roman political culture, for whatever else can be said about it, could not be said to be particularly modest about ambition or the containing of ambition. I'm trying to remember other stuff about the Byzantine Empire. I know that Venice played a big role in its history. Venice had been part of the empire from very early on. But Venice became so powerful economically in its own right that it de facto became independent. But Venice was able to use the fact that it was still kind of sort of technically part of the Byzantine Empire to get privileged access to the Byzantine Empire's markets, which was not something that a lot of other trading cities were able to do. And that helped contribute to the rise of Venice as a major trading power.
Interesting. I didn't get to go to Venice when I went to Italy. Went to Florence. That was probably the biggest city that I went to. Firenze.
Yeah, the city-states in Italy were very cutthroat as far as competing with each other. They went at it pretty hard for many centuries.
Mm.
Yeah, Venice is the most famous. You mentioned Florence. Genoa was a major contender. And there was a bunch of sort of second-tier contenders as well. I don't even remember most of their names. But yeah, it was a very active scene there. Lots of wars, lots of patronage, lots of pride, ego, etc. You know, a big reason the Renaissance was able to emerge and succeed as a force for pushing the Enlightenment in European society was specifically because wealthy elites in Italy in the late Middle Ages competed with each other in part by patronizing great works of art, great works of, well, great writing, great philosophers, etc. And so, you know, a lot of that was to a degree immutable. You know, a lot of that Enlightenment thinking and development and science and whatnot was already happening and developing and evolving. But patronage by the wealthy elite definitely supercharged it and spread it to a much broader degree and embedded it in European culture more deeply than would have been possible without that patronage, without that competition. So you can thank egotistical, competitive rich people in part for the Enlightenment.
Similarly to that, on a more local scale, we can thank the individual patronage of the people of this stream for supporting this kind of content and conversation we have here, because on a smaller scale, you don't necessarily need to be a rich elite to sponsor something. Like, you can now be a part of a Kickstarter for some game project if you think it sounds cool, or support a stream. Or in the case of Kukio, I was telling my girlfriend today that he basically paid our rent during a period of our lives where neither of us were in the best position to do so, and he scored a really excellent job for being post-university, and how he decided just for his own dollar that he said, well, it's worth it for you guys to be with me because I believe in what you're doing, and I think it's really awesome, plus I enjoy hanging out with you. So yeah, he was basically our patron for a period of time.
Oh yeah,
that was really big.
I remember it fondly.
Yeah, I told Trisha about the Agent Smith on the couch era. Where he was, I had a room, Kukio had a room, and Agent Smith had a couch and his PC next to it. We would all kind of go about our business during the day, and then in the evening we would have beverages and like watch a documentary and talk about random shit. So good times.
Definitely a highlight of my life.
Hell yeah. Yeah, and he was just a regular dude. Like, he wasn't super rich or anything, but made enough that it was enough for his personal needs of what he would want to spend money on and stuff. And then beyond that, helping people out with their projects was really cool. There were a couple random times where he just has a cousin or someone who has a medical problem, and he ships like $600 at him, no hesitation. And he doesn't ask for anything in return as well, which I think a lot of people, they see like, ooh, this is an opportunity for me to get this person in my pocket, and now they're going to owe me, sort of a deal. But just the unconditional support of, I like what you do, I want you to succeed, here's some momentum toward your goal. That's a really important power that basically any individual can have with their money. So thanks, Kukio, and thank you everyone who supports the stream to this day, so we can keep the lights on. Hell yeah.
Yeah, your patronage and support is much valued and appreciated. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for you too, in so much as you host me on here.
Hell yeah, dude. Man, if I didn't have you on Sundays, I'd be heckin' dried out of ideas.
Sure.
It is nice though, jokes aside. There are some days where I've had to deal with a bunch of stuff and a bunch of different issues throughout the week, and I get ready for real discussion. It's like, all right, someone else can talk for a minute. So it does give me some relief. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm sure you could find something. There's no shortage of stuff to do. Baldur's Gate, if nothing else.
Yeah. Horny gate.
It very much is.
Yep. They know their audience. It's about time someone sees us for what we really are.
Really, yeah. That very phrase is something I uttered several times during my first playthrough.
Yeah, they know who they're dealing with. Horny degen gamers. Finally, they're marketing something to us and not pretending to be like Disney friendly.
Yeah, very much so.
Did you hear anything about Starfield? I guess this is unrelated to news, but there were people in the chat who were kind of comparing that to being the sci-fi Baldur's Gate. Chat, do you still say that it's like on the level of that or not quite? I haven't played it at all, so I can't say anything.
Well, I mean, it's made by the studio that made Skyrim.
Mm-hmm.
So I had thought that it was more like a space version of Skyrim. Is it not?
I don't know. I didn't play it, but maybe.
That
They
was
were
my
just saying it was like
understanding.
one of the best RPGs of the year.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't go out of my way to buy AAA games in general, but certainly not certainly not in the year after release. That's generally outside my budget. Even Baldur's Gate I wouldn't have done if you hadn't got it for me. So thanks again for that, by the way.
You're welcome.
It's been quite the adventure. Yeah, it's interesting too, because one of the benefits to waiting a couple years to buy a game is that it gives them time, that is to say the developer, time to hash out all the little bugs and mistakes and whatnot. Yeah, but when you play earlier, you can still see those. I definitely encountered some in my first playthrough.
Yeah. That's one of the funny parts of gaming is it'll be like really immersive and great, and then your character is just bald for the next scene because your hair didn't load or something. Or this one character is like sideways stuck on a wall. I've had multiple times when my character loaded in and they were like doing a plank pose like on the floor when they should have been having a conversation with the character. It's like, I guess you just role play that and play it as it lies.
Yeah, one of the ones that stood out to me for Baldur's Gate is that after you end a rest, when you wake up in the morning, everybody walks away from their sleeping bag back to their tent. But sometimes the animation of them standing up doesn't happen, and you just see them lying on the ground floating towards their tent.
That's funny.
Yeah, that kind of caught my eye.
Yeah.
I thought, that's not supposed to happen.
Definitely not.
Yeah, I could talk about Baldur's Gate for a while, but I don't want to spoil anything for your audience, so I'll seal my lips. Yeah, definitely hit me up when you finish. That's a fun game. There's lots to talk about there.
As it lies. I didn't even mean to make a pun there, but that's good. You really played that one as it lied.
Yeah, are you familiar with Klingons?
Klingons, yeah. From Star Trek?
I remember you said you weren't like a big Star Trek guy.
No, but those are like so popular that even non-Star Trek people have seen them. And I have seen some Star Trek. So they're very warlike people. Kind of like almost Mongolian warriors is kind of what they seem to be modeled off of. Where it's very merit-based, pursuing the glory of battle, taking territory, bring honor to your ancestors, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I very much got that vibe from the Gith in the game.
Oh, yeah.
Like, even the way that they occasionally drop words in their own language very much reminded me of how Klingons do that in Star Trek.
Oh, yeah.
It's probably one of the reasons I liked them.
Yeah.
I was pretty patient, even in spite of some of the bullshit.
Yeah.
I wanted Girl Worf on my team.
Lae'zel. Yeah, she's very funny in how she talks. That's one of the things that's hard to do in a fantasy setting is make the characters speak in a way that makes them seem alien in their language. Because the default thing is, well, you're a human author and you're trying to describe what an alien talks like. How do you do that? You have to break some normal mannerisms and ways of speaking that we typically go for.
Yeah.
Were there any other things that people in the chat were curious about or wanted an update on? We can talk about video games all day. This isn't world discussion with Agent Smith. This is video game discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, I mean, if not for the spoilers, which again, we will not spoil the game for you, but if not for that, we could definitely talk about like the politics in the game.
Oh yeah,
which are a whole subject unto themselves. Is a whole subject unto itself. I keep using the plural when I mean the singular. So that would be a fun topic.
Mm-hmm.
But let's see. There's weird stuff too that's happened. But I usually save that for the end of the stream.
Mm.
And I think we've still got 30 minutes?
Yeah.
Thereabouts. What else did we have? I really need to organize these notes again. I don't know. Pick a region.
Africa.
You always pick Africa.
That's because you say that we always forget about Africa.
That's true. Fair enough.
Okay. Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia. Okay. What was the newest thing? We already talked about the Thai elections. I don't think there's anything going on in Malaysia. There was a scandal in Singapore not too long ago. Did you hear about that?
No.
It was a big scandal that rocked Singapore's politics, and it resulted in the resignation of a, what was it? It was a cabinet member, I think. A very senior high-level cabinet member. And it really kind of brought the, the Singapore People's Party, the main political party in Singapore, the de facto pseudo-authoritarian party that's been running it for more than half a century. It kind of brought them into ill repute, made them look bad. And it did kind of create some sense that maybe the opposition would have relatively more support in the elections that happened not long after, although that didn't end up happening, really. But the scandal was that this guy had cheated on his wife with a staffer.
Oh. And
that was enough to cause a major scandal. It seems almost quaint now in the context of American politics with everything that's happened here to see a major scandal be cheating.
Well, wasn't that the thing in Clinton, his presidency?
Oh, that was 20 years ago, man. I'm talking like the past 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, but people go through different stages of development. Maybe they're going through their dramatized divorce phase.
They're not. That's not what's happening. You know, Singapore's political economy and its political culture is very conservative. Uh-huh. It's static. It's resistant to change. Let's put it like that. But it's also fairly professional and competent. It's maybe not quite fully meritocratic, but they do lean in that direction. So, you know, that's more the reason why this happened. You know, in general, scandals like this are very rare. So when they do happen, it's big news. Mm-hmm. And it's even bigger news when it's a relatively high-level official, because generally the Singapore People's Party, and again, I'm not sure if I'm remembering the name right, generally they go out of their way to suppress stuff like this. It's not something that generally comes out in the open all that often. Because keep in mind, given the political party's power, which is quite broad and deep in Singapore, they have a lot of influence over the media. Mm. So, you know, they do allow the media to criticize the government to some degree, but going after salacious stories like this in order to kind of denigrate somebody's character in government, that doesn't happen as much as I understand it. Mm. So it was notable that this one made the front pages. That kind of suggested he pissed off not only his wife, but probably some people in government too. If not for that, it probably wouldn't have been reported on at all. But yeah, if you're just a quiet small country with a quiet political culture, it doesn't take a whole lot to cause a big political scandal. You know,
right.
Precedent matters. You know, if something is unprecedented, it will be noteworthy and reported on. But if there's not much that's been happening, it doesn't take much to really cross that threshold. especially if it's been a very quiet country for a long period of time. In the United States, you'd have to do something pretty egregious at this point in order for it to be really headline worthy. We're kind of past the point where innocence is really the definition of the political culture at this currently. People have been throwing rockets at American personnel and bases in Iraq and Syria. Had you heard about that?
No.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you can't say it's Iranian specifically without evidence, but probably it's militias in Syria and Iraq acting on behalf of the Iranian government. And they've been justifying it. That is to say, the militias involved have been justifying it as part of their retaliation against Israel's strikes and possible impending ground incursion targeting Gaza and Hamas. So you could do it to a degree, say that the United States is kind of embroiled to a degree, is involved in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, specifically the most recent iteration in Gaza, in so much as these rocket attacks are part and parcel of that conflict. But I also don't think it's likely they're going to escalate that much, and the American presence in Syria and Iraq is actually pretty small, so they don't have a whole lot to go after anyway. But you could read about that in the news if it does escalate, so something to keep in mind. Also keep in mind that in so much as that is, again, probably being done at the behest of the Iranian government, that illustrates that the tensions between Iran and the United States are not always cold, so to speak. That is to say, they do not always restrain themselves to non-violent forms of pressure against each other. The recent rocket attacks are an example of Iranian violence in that vein. And of course, the United States does not refrain from violence always either. Certainly, we've targeted militias aligned with Iran before, up to and including one of the most important militia leaders in Iraq, who was assassinated in the same airstrike that killed that Iranian Special Forces general. I think Soleimani was his name.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So to a degree, you could say that was an outlier. You could say that was Trump being his usual mercurial self, but even looking beyond that, the United States has targeted militias sort of in a similar way before, just generally not militia members of quite so high a profile. That was a little bit unusual in that sense. What else? Oh, you mentioned Southeast Asia. Let's see. So what else is going on there? Laos has economic problems, but I don't know that much will come of that. One of the things people don't understand about Laos is that while it's true that China has an immense amount of economic influence over Laos, to the point where, like, the main economic activity along the northern border between Laos and China is basically gambling. There's a lot of resorts, gambling houses, etc., casinos that have been built along the border in order to attract Chinese tourists. And so that's been a major, driver of investment and economic activity in that northern region of Laos. But also Laos exports a lot of stuff to China and imports a lot of stuff from China. And China is building a major railway that's going to hypothetically eventually connect China over land to Singapore. We'll see if that ever actually happens, but they've already finished the rail connecting China to Laos. So that obviously makes trade much more cheaper. Trade between Laos and China much cheaper and more efficient, and hence more attractive, and hence more relevant to Laos's economy. But that said, keep in mind, in spite of all that economic influence, Vietnam has just as much, if not more, political influence. Keep in mind, Laos's party, that is to say Laos's government, is dominated by the Communist Party of Laos. It's an authoritarian one-party state. There we go. But the Laos's Communist Party did not emerge in a vacuum. It was actually largely backed and even organized by Vietnam's Communist Party, back during the Indochina War and then during the Vietnam War with the United States. And so, to a degree, Laos's Communist Party is a proxy of the Vietnamese Communist Party, and by extension, the Vietnamese government. Now, to a degree, that's not to say that Laos's government and its Communist Party are not completely without agency. They do have that. But Laos's Communist Party still sends their people to train with the Vietnam's Communist Party. And there are still some Vietnamese military ties with Laos as well. I don't know if they still have bases there, but they still exchange officers. Vietnam still trains Laos's military units, etc. So yes, economic influence is there, but keep in mind, Vietnam never really watered down, and Vietnam retained its ties and its influence over Laos's Communist Party left over from the Vietnam War. And that gives them a degree of influence that gives them a special edge over Laos that China cannot really meet. That's not to say that the money doesn't matter, and that's not to say that the economic influence could not end up being more important. Obviously, Laos's government and the Communist Party there wants more money. That allows them to be more independent, wealthier, builds their legitimacy, etc. So in so much as China can provide that, that does offset Vietnamese influence. But I feel like people often discount Vietnamese influence unfairly, or maybe even don't know that it exists, with the result that Laos is generally considered a de facto Chinese satellite state at this point, when in fact, I don't think it's really fair to conclude that, at least not yet. Let's see. Cambodia has been in the news. So there was a president that had ruled Cambodia for like 30 years. I want to say they're about pretty much since the early 1990s. And he finally resigned. That doesn't actually mean anything because he's been running the country as basically his personal business that whole time. And guess who his successor is? Just so happens to be his son.
Oh.
What a coincidence.
Wow.
Yeah, so he's still going to run the political party that manages Cambodia. He won't technically be president, but as the senior official in the party who ran the country for 30 years, he has paramount power within that organization. So de jure, he will not be in power anymore. De facto, he will be. This is more about trying to groom his son for power so that he can inherit the kingdom from his father. That is the general consensus as far as interpreting this event.
Gotcha.
So some people hold out hope, that is to say, some dissidents in Cambodia hold out hope that maybe once the father passes, the son might be more liberal-minded and might be more reformist and take the country in a different direction, but it's anybody's guess. And the fact that they think like that at all kind of betrays the fact that Cambodia effectively has become a monarchy, which is funny because technically it actually was already a monarchy on paper. They actually have a king that they brought back after the violence of the 1970s. So technically it is a constitutional monarchy, but the monarch has like no power. It's purely symbolic. In truth, the real power lie with the president. But the president is not really a president. He's effectively the king, because again, he runs the country like his personal kingdom as an autocrat. And, in most democracies or republics or whatnot, generally the president does not appoint his son, the new president, to succeed him. That's something that monarchies do. So that's why I say it's become a monarchy.
You're saying George W. Bush was not appointed after George H.W. Bush.
Some would say he was, but I disagree. I'm a lot more sanguine about the disputed 2000 presidential election than I think a lot of people are. Let's see. Burma's civil war is ongoing. That hasn't changed. The rebels are getting more organized. They've been able to take pretty substantive swaths of the country in the northwest. Mind you, the government already had basically lost control of the northeast of the country to various ethno-nationalist militias that it's been fighting off and on again for the past 70 years. So that was not really territory under dispute as a result of the Civil War's initiation a couple of years ago. The far north of the country, they still have a stronger presence, but rebels have been making inroads. So overall, the trend is positive if you're anti-junta and pro-rebel. The south of the country still remains a pretty thoroughgoing Junta stronghold, not so much in terms of public support, mind you, but more in terms of government control. So until the rebels are able to seize enough territory in the rest of the country, specifically the center and the northwest, where most of the fighting is, they're probably not going to push south. And they're going to have to push south eventually if they expect to really be able to substantively challenge the military for control of the country. So it's very early days yet. It's looking like it's going to be another one of those grueling, murderous 10-year civil wars that kills shit tons of people and probably ends anticlimactically and unsatisfyingly.
Damn.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, but that's where it's at. Did we ever talk about the ethnic violence in northeastern India?
I don't know if we did. I remember the sword battle.
No, it wasn't the sword battle. That was a different thing. Well, northeastern India is a territory that a lot of people kind of forget about, including people in India. Even they kind of forget it exists a lot of the time. And it's kind of sort of in Southeast Asia. It kind of straddles the line between Southeast Asia and South Asia, but I'll kind of throw it in here since we're talking about Southeast Asia. Yeah, if you look at a map, you can see it pretty clearly, but if you look at a map, it also doesn't look like it's part of India. I think the first time I showed northeastern India to somebody on a map, they actually said that they had assumed that was a separate country. But no, it is actually sovereign Indian territory, albeit one that is connected to India proper by the most narrow of slivers of territory, the so-called chicken neck in northeastern India. So northeastern India is distinct because the people there, well, the most obvious thing that distinguishes the territory is that the people are Asian in physical appearance, unlike the rest of India. Now, their language is much more influenced by South Asian influences, although there are some Thai influences. When I say Thai, I mean T-A-I, Thai, not T-H-A-I, Thai. The latter form is more Thailand, and the Thai language there. But Thai, T-A-I, is actually the language in sort of that southern Chinese region, northeastern Burma region. That's sort of the progenitor for a lot of languages in Southeast Asia. But there are still some Thai speakers left. And they kind of form part of the influence linguistically in northeastern India. So the thing to know about northeastern India beyond language and the fact that they're Asian is the fact that it's basically hill country. The territory is very rugged. So there's not a lot of arable land, and the result is that it's never really been densely populated. And as a result, there hasn't been a whole lot of civilizational development there. Most of the people there are fairly tribal, and the degree of economic development is very low. It pretty much has been forever. Now, the result is that tribal conflict is not uncommon historically. You know, again, very poor land, very few resources to work with, so invariably people fight over what few resources they are. Not surprising. But the more recent ethnic violence stems more from religion and ethnicity. You know, the people of the region, even if they fight with each other over resources, or at least used to historically, do have a distinctive regional identity, separate from that of, say, the neighboring ethnic Bengalis in Bengal. And that became a problem in the early 20th century, thereabouts, maybe late 19th century, early 20th century. What happened is that more and more ethnic Bengalis were migrating into the hill country to work on tea plantations that had been created by British investors in order to make money. As you can see by casually perusing headlines on whatever your choice of news outlet is, people do not like being inundated by outsiders. That's a pretty common theme, regardless of territory, society, or people. And the influx of Bengalis working on the plantations was large enough to inculcate a fear that they were being displaced. And the result was a significant upsurge in not only ethnic identity amongst the various tribal peoples, but a not insignificant degree of perpetual and intermittent ethnic violence targeting Bengali minorities in the territory, as well as other people who came to live there who were not native. So that ethnic violence was on again, off again over time. The British were able to suppress it, and then the Indian government subsequently was also able to kind of keep it to a relatively minimal level. But they've never been able to stop it completely. One of the defining organizations of the region after India's independence was an Assamese liberation organization. Assam is the largest province in northeastern India, and the ethnic Assamese people in that province have a very strong ethnic identity, even more so than the surrounding tribal peoples. And they're quite proud. And one of the things they wanted was independence, because they didn't want to be a part of India in the first place, really. And so the Indian government, very early after independence, faced an Assamese independence movement. And when I say independence movement, I don't mean like mass protest. I mean they violently rebelled against the Indian government. They didn't quite have enough strength to take on the Indian army, but they did engage in hit-and-run attacks, terrorism, etc. And the Indian government then proceeded to fight with that group for the next 40 years, thereabouts. It was a fairly long conflict. I don't think they were able to successfully negotiate a substantive peace agreement ending the violence until the early mid-aughts, if I'm remembering correctly, so around 2005. So even after that, the ethnic identity of the people there has been quite strong. But while there is peace with the Indian government, they've still been targeting ethnic minorities in the territory, especially Muslims. Whether you're an ethnic Bengali Muslim or a native tribal person who happens to be Muslim, they get targeted regardless. And the reason they do is because Muslims in general are seen as the interlopers. There was already some Hindu presence in the territory, so they kind of get a pass to a degree. But Islam and Bengali are kind of, what's the right word? Interchangeable. From the perspective of the tribal peoples in northeastern India, to be Bengali is to be Muslim, and to be Muslim is to be Bengali. And again, it's mostly the Bengalis that were migrating into the territory to the point where there was a violent ethno-nationalist backlash. So anybody who's Muslim is just kind of assumed to be an outsider, somebody who is probably Bengali, or at the very least, a migrant. And as a result, Muslims in general have received the bulk of the violence in the territory. Now, again, the violence waxes and wanes depending on era, depending on incident, depending on politics, etc. But there was a recent incident in which, well, I shouldn't say incident. There was a recent push by one tribal minority ethnic group, not a Muslim one either. They just kind of always lived there. They wanted their territory to be carved out of the Indian state that they were in and made independent, or alternatively to be made autonomous within their state. And this was seen as a direct attack on the ethnic majority in that state, which believed that their territory and state were sacrosanct and should not be divided up and bifurcated for the benefit of a minority. Now, that by itself would not have been enough to cause violence, but there had already been tension between these two tribal groups. The majority tribal group accused the minority group of engaging in a lot of drug running, basically cooking up a lot of meth, opioids, etc., and selling them for revenue, and being intertwined significantly with international drug networks, which of course people in the territory did not like. So the ethnic minority in turn accused the ethnic majority of monopolizing political power in the state to the detriment of the ethnic minority, to the point where they did not feel particularly representative, that is to say, represented in the state government, nor did they feel that their particular interests were being served in terms of public resources, public services, and the distribution thereof by the state government. So tensions were already pretty bad on those counts, and eventually violence broke out. Eventually there was some violence acts carried out against this or the other ethnic group. There was retaliation. That retaliation sparked retaliation, and then tit-for-tat reciprocal attacks occurred until basically the entire tribal territory was aflame with paranoia and ethnic violence. In one of the articles I read, there was one community that had built a bunker and the bunker was constantly manned just in case there was an attack, which was expected at virtually any time. That was just the degree of paranoia. So the Indian government did exactly fuck all about this, which was kind of a bold choice as far as ethnic violence goes, in your own country, no less. But the Modi administration did not particularly seem interested in recognizing the violence. For one, because they recognized, likely correctly, that there wasn't a whole lot the Indian government could actually do, given that the violence was communal in nature. If it was an uprising against the government, they would have taken it more seriously. But if people want to kill each other, there's not a whole lot you can do. That's kind of different. So for several months, the Modi administration didn't really say anything about it. And then during that same time, the opposition took the opportunity to kind of ridicule him for that. They believed the administration should have been much more forthright about the existence of this problem, for one, and then should have been much more active in dealing with it. And I think a month or two into the violence, the Modi administration finally recognized it in a speech, but he didn't say a whole lot about it. For the moment, the role of the Indian army in the territory has been, proscribed, has been restricted. They're not doing as much as they could. They could flood the territory and try to make it as difficult as possible for militants to move around, set up checkpoints, etc. Typical counterinsurgency stuff. But as is, they've mostly just been establishing a quote-unquote presence. They exist, but they're not being very proactive about chasing down militants or otherwise prosecuting acts of violence. More or less, they're standing by. Unless something happens like right next to them, in that case, they do something. But, they're not being nearly as aggressive as they would be against, say, the Maoists rebelling against the government in the east of India, or against militant Islamist groups in Kashmir, Very clear that there's a difference in how these different groups are approached by India's security services. That may be done in the case of Assam for political reasons, because Assam has a BJP-allied government right now. Well, I shouldn't say Assam. I think the tribal territory in question has a BJP-aligned government right now. I forget which specific state it is. It's one of the so-called Seven Sisters up in the Northeast, but yeah, my memory isn't producing the name, but it's one of the small ones. Assam is the big one, and then Arunachal Pradesh is a little bit smaller, and then the remaining 5 are just very small tribal states carved out of that territory up there. But yeah, the Indian government may be trying to kind of relax its response to the territory, may be kind of relaxed in its response to the violence, possibly because the local BJP ally in that territory requested them do so. That's conjecture. I can't say for that for sure, but that is at least one explanation that makes some sense. It makes more sense than any other explanation I've heard for why the Indian government has been fairly restrained in its response. So we'll see what happens. I haven't heard about the violence in a while, so maybe that means it's dying down, but who's to say?
It's interesting with the depth of India's history, the perception of different religions and how they're the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, which means they've seen from the oldest to the newest, and the way that they perceive each group is partly related to the time in that kind of religious tradition and lineage. One thing that I know as a Christian is that it's an Abrahamic religion, which has its roots in Judaism, which is the Old Testament of the Bible, and then Islam was one that came after that of Muhammad came and had a prophecy and whatnot, and they have their holy text that's after that. So relative to Hinduism, Christianity is very new. Islam is very new. Hinduism has been around for a long time. And then there were likely local traditions that have existed way longer before then. I went to a Nordic Heritage Museum here in Seattle a couple weeks ago. Pretty cool. One of the things that was interesting was how paganism, like the Norse paganism, was woven into Nordic Christianity, where they would end up having certain Bible figures that just had one eye, and they were kind of like Odin. So they would make it more relatable. They weave it into what's local and what existed before it. and how for any given region you're going to have some blend of the like strictly religious text and then the local customs, and how for it to exist in a strong way in that region, it needs to include both.
Yep. Thursday.
Yep. Thursday is Tears Day. Or Thor's Day.
Yeah, that kind of blending you can see everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Chinese Christians historically had a well, obviously they depicted him as Chinese, right? But the result was some very unique, interesting artwork depicting Christian scenes, mythology, etc. Well, maybe mythology isn't the right word, but you know what I mean. Yeah, there's a lot of Christians, actually, now that you mention it, up in northeastern India, specifically the tribal peoples. Christian missionaries have done a lot of work there. They've been mostly pagan, you know, not Hindu or Muslim, but just traditional animists of one kind or another. So Christian missionaries moved in, and they were able to convert pretty large swaths of the tribal population in northeastern India.
I was talking with Chad about that before we started world discussion, and just how someone asked me randomly if I was a religious or spiritual person and my perception of reality and whatnot. For you, from what I know, you're not practicing any religion and you have a fairly secular worldview. I would guess it's kind of the dry and scientific approach to stuff.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty accurate.
Is your family religious?
That's an interesting question. The most succinct answer I could give is kind of. Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, spiritual, but not practicing. They believe, but they don't really follow through on the minutiae of rituals and various other specific practices. And debatable at times just how committed they were to some of the major tenets.
Yeah.
I'll limit myself to that on that count. So yes, religious, you know, they do believe. My aunt in particular kind of really found religion when she was younger. And my grandfather went to a Catholic school and spent the rest of his life as a staunch Catholic. And when I mean staunch, I mean he staunchly believed that Catholicism and Christianity was a positive force. But he also never went to church again after the mid 70s. And he himself had a rather, liberal attitude versus various social issues.
Yeah.
So to say. He was not a social liberal at all in that sense, but he gave himself a lot more discretion than you might expect a pious man to have. I'm kind of beating around the bush, but basically the idea is, yes, they're religious, but they're the kind of religious people that kind of don't practice it that seriously. It's more ornamental than it is substantive to a degree.
Yeah, I've heard it described as shopping cart as well, where you kind of go through the religious tradition and you pick out the stuff that you like and you put that in your cart and you apply that to your life. And then some stuff you're like, not as much. You don't really apply it or put it in the forefront of what you believe. One of the things that's kind of interesting is if you get down into very specific biblical rules and laws, some of them only really make sense for living in that time period. And you can interpret them and how they might apply to us in the present day, but they were really focused on, like, you're not supposed to wear clothing of these two fabrics together, or you're not supposed to eat this or eat this. And there may have been reasons why back in the time. But yeah, it's an interesting set of decisions to make, where there are a whole bunch of different denominations for these religions, and many of them are more progressive or more conservative relative to the old rules and the old laws, and people kind of choose their own adventure with it. I think my family overall was a lot more religious than yours was.
Oh yeah, definitely. From what I know of them, yeah, far more.
Yeah. What would you say drives you to pursue knowledge and goals and stuff in life? Because that's one of the things that religion can tell people, is this is your purpose. But have you had just like internal thought process of that for yourself, of trying to figure out your meaning and your purpose in the world as a secular person?
I think anybody who has a somewhat tumultuous childhood is invariably philosophically in survival mode. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, making your way, being self-sufficient, and however you need to do that is your main concern.
Survivalist,
so,
yeah.
Yeah. So no, I haven't ever really thought intrinsically about it. Mm-hmm. In general, the attitude that was inculcated in me when I was growing up and that I saw reflected in, other people was that, if you've got a roof over your head and you've got food in your belly, you're doing okay. Mm-hmm. That's what's important. Survival first. Everything else is just kind of extra. I was interested in, military history, economics, etc. That was kind of just an organic evolution. And I saw that as a viable path to follow once I was in college. But I never really stopped, I never really thought in terms of like impetus. It was always, okay, how can I make a living? I'm going to be an accountant. So let's do that because that's a safe way to go. That's like a safe, secure path. And I didn't really change my mind about that until like halfway through undergrad when I switched over to economics. And I saw that as a risk, but I also kind of angsted a lot about that, about, just going with the safe path versus the risky path. If I go the safe path, I'll probably be financially secure, but I'll also probably wonder not only about what could have been, but will probably fail to answer a lot of questions about the world affairs, etc., that I can't really explore while I'm being a professional accountant.
Yeah.
So my approach, I also wanted to be a historian, but I kind of discounted that because I didn't think that would be a good way of making money, which again kind of illustrates that mindset. You're thinking, how am I going to survive? Historian isn't going to cut it, so that's off the table, prima facie. Eventually, later on, well, I mean, again, it was a risk. And so, I just thought the compromise between history and accounting was economics, because I thought, well, like accounting, it's something that's marketable. It is a marketable skill, but it allows some overlap with history such that I could go in that direction and kind of explore some things that I'm curious and interested about. And, that's prototypical waffling, half in, half out logic, which has plagued me for my entire life. The results were not great, unfortunately. If I was going to go with economics, I should have structured my curriculum and my plans much differently than I did. But it did lead me down a path where I ended up in a PhD program, and I was able to do some research, a lot of reading, et cetera, a lot of learning, and a lot of new experiences that I would have not had otherwise. And that was definitely very formative. And it's not put me on a path of self-sufficiency, to put it mildly. But on the other hand, I don't know, even knowing that I would say I would trade it.
Hell yeah. Well, you're very knowledge-seeking. I think that's one of your traits that defines you as a person, more so than a lot of other people. Like, you're willing to invest the time in reading and in watching stuff just to understand more so of what's going on a deeper level. And that's something that I think counterbalances one of the most punishing forces in the world right now, which is the diminishing attention span of people based on loud visual signals and audio signals and drama. And that nature that you bring to the world is really, really vital, I think, for our survival, just as creatures that have the capacity to think critically and also to do our research. Because it feels way better to just listen to a hot take, agree with them, and then share it and try to make the opposition feel bad. That's kind of the temptation here. But like really delving into a deeper history that's more complex and nuanced, many people don't have the patience for that. But that's one of the things that I've always looked to you for, is you're passionate about it. And that means that I have someone who, in a very sober and just meticulous scientific way, you kind of navigate through the space of information and try to piece together stuff. So I'm super grateful that you went on the path that you did. I definitely would be more vulnerable to the whims of the internet and the stupid takes that people post on Twitter.
Oh, thank you. That is encouraging. I only wish Bank of America shared your enthusiasm for my life choices.
Tonight's stream is not sponsored by Bank of America. It's actually sponsored by the subscribers. Also, thank you to everyone who's like thrown out dollars for Agent Smith's time. That's a big part of my weekly flow of content, and it's actually one of the most information dense parts of content of the week. I do tend to sometimes like be between ideas and between video projects, and I'm just playing games and talking about mindset, but the opportunity to discuss the bigger picture here and also learn from chat. I feel like this is one of the more open and healthy forums of information, just because we don't really have an agenda. At least I don't think I have an agenda, aside from stating facts in a way that doesn't get people butt mad. But you have a lot of fans here. People saying that you need to stream, people asking if you're at TwitchCon. I don't think he's in Vegas right now. Are you in Vegas right now?
I am in Dallas, Texas.
Okay. You're not partying it up in Vegas. We won't be mad at you. No, he's an introvert hermit like me. That was the great thing about me, Agent Smith, and Kukyo living in the same place is all three of us are hermits and we're all nerds. So we just like chill inside and talk about nerdy shit. You're good to go.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I did meet your challenge this week, by the way.
Oh, yeah?
Since you mentioned going outside, I did walk for 20 minutes.
Heck yeah. Have you ever done 30?
I have. I think I did. I've done 30 before.
Okay. Well, you're going to do 30 again. I believe in you.
Gonna make me do 4 laps instead of 3, huh?
Yep. That's okay. What would a Githyanki do?
You know, Githyanki would not be in such poor physical condition in the first place. Probably would have never made it out of the crash in the first place in that case.
Do your psionic leaps and you can make it.
There you go. Psionic leaps. That's the way.
Well, we're about out of time. I appreciate your input as always, and thank you, chat, for weighing in the discussion with us. I'll publish the VOD after so we can read the chat and respond to you. And if you have a comment for us, this will be posted to YouTube as well. Thank you, everyone who watches from YouTube. So with that, thank you, Agent Smith, and we'll see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG! Nice. Oh, man. That's a good question just after we ended. Agent Smith, what is the most conspiratorial and unpopular view that you have? Wow. Agent Smith, what is your hottest, spiciest, weird take?